Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Maggie Livingston. I'm the faculty director of the DePaul Center for Animal Law, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to our symposium, The Legal Protection of Aquatic Life. Before I first speaker, I would like to thank individuals, Ken Kniff, International Institute for Animal Law. Ken and the Institute have faithfully supported our programs for years, and we're very grateful to them. And also Brett Harrison Davinger, who's the Associate Director of the DePaul Center for Animal Law, and who was instrumental in putting together this symposium. A couple of housekeeping matters. Please attendee video and audio off at all times. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Each speaker will speak uninterrupted for a period of time, and then we will open it up to questions, and I will moderate those questions through the chat. For many of us, the opportunities to enjoy oceans and seas are among our most treasured memories. We watch with amazement as gigantic cartwheel in and out of the water. We study lumbering turtles that crawl across sandy beaches to deposit eggs. We shiver as a shark, its fin breaking through the water, passes so closely by our turboat that we imagine the movie Jaws. There is so much aquatic life to admire that we may fail to see that those creatures suffer when we ignore ugly events that threaten their existence. It is easy to believe that they are intruding our enjoyment of the oceans and seas. In reality, we are invading their world. Too often we see aquatic animals of little importance existing only for our amusement. We barely consider the reality that failing to confront what is happening to them may ultimately imperil our futures. The purpose of this symposium is to explore how appropriate legal protections can reduce unnecessary intrusions on aquatic life. You will hear experts, law professors, marine biologists, and animal advocates focus on the challenges that the law overcome to improve aquatic life for everyone's benefit. Our first speaker this afternoon and our featured speaker is Professor Jason Czarnezki, who is the Gilbert and Sarah Curlin Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law and Associate Dean of Environmental Law Program Strategic Initiatives, as well as the inaugural Faculty Director of the Sustainable Business Law Hub at the Elizabeth Howe School of Policy at Pace University. He specializes in environmental and natural resources law and policy, sustainable business strategies, and food systems policy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jason Czarnezki.
Thank you so much for having me. Now I'll go about and attempt to share my screen, which is always an adventure. Hopefully this will work. There we go. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me to this symposium. There's actually I've really enjoyed my career, and especially my interaction with the faculty and students at DePaul Law. I was a visiting professor there almost 20 years ago now. So thank you for welcoming me back virtually. What I'd like to talk about today is how might sustainable business practices, the emergence of sustainable business law, private environmental governance, and private environmental norms might fill some gaps when there might be a failure of public environmental law to protect our marine environment. So today I'd like to divide my talk into three parts. Hopefully I'll talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. We can have at least 10 minutes of Q&A. First, I just want some overview of some existing public laws that deal with the marine space and what might be the perceived gaps in those laws. And then what is sustainable business or sustainable business law, or some of you might have heard the term ESG, and how might that be applicable to the marine space. There are a number of existing public laws that attempt to deal with water quality, and pollution in the aquatic and ocean environment. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these. Just some examples, you have the Clean Water Act. Under the Clean Water Act, for example, the US government collected an unprecedented $5 billion penalty from BP for the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster. There are other things like the Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships. This requires, a low sulfur fuel for our ships. It establishes nitrous oxide emission limits. And there are other acts like the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. This is often known as the Ocean Dumping Act. This prohibits, for example, the dumping of material from outside the United States within the U.S. territorial sea. There's the Oil Pollution Act and the Marine Debris Act to help us do things like respond to oil spills. And so there are a number of existing public regulations to protect our aquatic environment and the water quality and pollution space. As another example, there are public laws to manage our fisheries and our stocks. Probably the most well-known one is the Magnuson-Stevens Act. This divides our country into 8 regional fisheries designed to do things like prevent overfishing, rebuild overfished stocks, and attempt to protect crucial habitats for the spawning, breeding, and feeding of our fisheries. There are also efforts to protect vulnerable species in the marine environment. Both the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act prevent the taking, so the harassing, hunting, or killing of endangered species that are listed. What's interesting to note is that some marine mammals are protected both under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. However, the Marine Mammal Protection Act provides protection for more marine mammals because some marine mammals, of course, are not listed as threatened or endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. There are other public laws which give the federal government jurisdiction in terms of managing marine areas on the outer continental shelf and those submerged lands underneath water. This is the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, the Submerged Lands Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act. This is how the U.S. government asserts jurisdiction over these areas, which may impact the marine environment. I tell my students that if they ever want to become president of the United States, that there are 2 main reasons: Air Force One, and the other is the Antiquities Act of 1906. The Antiquities Act allows the president, by public proclamation, to establish national monuments on federal public lands because they contain historic landmarks or prehistoric structures, or they have scientific interest. And so the presidents are beginning to create national monuments to protect marine resources. So most recently, President Obama expanded a national marine monument off the coast of Hawaii. He proclaimed the creation of Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument in the Atlantic Ocean. And Congress has also passed the National Marine Sanctuaries Act in 1972. This allows the Secretary of Commerce, who supervises NOAA, to designate and protect areas of the marine environment with special national significance due to conservation, recreational, ecological reasons. Now, I briefly went over all the existing public environmental law that may protect our marine environment, but there's still lots of gaps in the law. 2 examples would be noise pollution and vessel strikes. Many marine mammals and other aquatic animals use underwater sound to communicate, to assess their environment. And so sound plays a critical role in their life-sustaining activities like foraging, breeding, navigating the water, avoiding predators. And humans have contributed to noise really since the beginning of the industrial age. And so depending on the type of noise, this can have a number of negative impacts on our aquatic wildlife. Temporary and permanent hearing loss, stress responses, abandonment of their preferred habitat or changing their migratory paths, as well as disrupting their natural behaviors. They might have trouble feeding or breeding or nursing. And so this is a huge issue that isn't really adequately dealt with in public law. And there's also a concern about physical collisions between marine species and vessels. Maybe the most common one that people will see is, manatees with, marks on their back by local motor, caused by the motors of local motorboats. There are other gaps in the existing law. Despite numerous anti-dumping laws, there are billions of pounds of trash that end up in the ocean every year. And marine animals often confuse these materials for food sources, and they ingest them or they become entangled in them, causing serious injury or death. Also, we have high concentrations of certain substances or nutrients that can be harmful to marine life. For example, nitrogen or phosphorus. While we need them for plant health, they can cause detrimental algae blooms in high concentrations, leading to toxic effects on our animal population. Also, excess nutrients can cause dead zones, which deplete the amount of oxygen, causing death of plant life and also marine animals to move out of their natural habitats. Another example of a gap in existing public law is overfishing. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, they believe that the world's fisheries have declined by 33% due to environmentally unsustainable fishing practices. And they also estimate that 85% of marine fish stocks are either fully exploited or currently overfished. So we have lots of problems with overfishing, but also unregulated, unpermitted, unreported fishing, bycatch, where you're accidentally fishing and retaining organisms which you aren't intending to, and then also ghost fishing gear, which can cause great damage of ecosystems because this is abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear, which just stays in our waters and can entrap, degrade in a way that's not beneficial for species. There are already a number of proposals to address these gaps. The Ocean Climate Plan, for example, distributed by the White House Ocean Policy Committee. NOAA has a noise strategy roadmap. There are lots of proposals for different types of legislation, and here is just a list of those things. But at the end of the day, we have a lot of public law, a lot of gaps in that public law. The question is, what can we do when public law fails? This is an article I wrote with one of my former students about sustainable business law. And sustainable business has been a buzzword now for the past 30 years. And might sustainable business practices or private environmental governance, might that help us create more sustainability in our ocean and marine environments? And when I'm talking about sustainability, I'm talking about all three pillars of sustainability: environmental health, social welfare, and economic justice. I think first we have to define sustainability. That can be quite difficult. Here's a quote from the Brundtland Commission, or some of you also might be familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And sustainability, as I mentioned, considers all types of issues related to our environmental, social, and economic welfare. But building off that definition of sustainability, it's clear that sustainable business has to look at a forward-looking future that takes into account all stakeholders, including those species within our national environment, right? So it's a business strategy which looks long-term at all those economic, social, and environmental factors. Some of you might be familiar with the phrase corporate social responsibility. Over time, we use the term corporate social responsibility less, and we'll talk more about ESG in a second. And corporate social responsibility is a responsibility amongst firms, amongst businesses, to meet the needs of their stakeholders and to create responsibility among the stakeholders to hold firms accountable for their actions. So CSR focuses on two things, right? The business itself creating voluntary standards on its actions, and paying attention to how their business is impacting their shareholders. CSR has come under a lot of criticism. It's just a greenwashing and public relations tool, rather than something that looks at really long-term impacts on the business and how those impacts are impacting our natural environment. Which is why I think ESG, you might have seen this term now more in reading newspapers. Now nearly all of the largest law firms in the United States have ESG or sustainable business practice groups. And so ESG has really emerged from CSR. And unlike CSR, ESG is a metrics-based approach. And so when you see the word ESG, it'll often be followed by the word criteria. So ESG criteria or ESG factors or ESG strategies or ESG standards. And the idea is that the business should be able to get and harness data about their impacts on the environment, about their impacts on society, and begin to actually measure and evaluate their impacts in each of these three spaces. So the E prong would examine how a business performs as a steward for the natural physical environment, things like energy use, climate change risks, how it's impacting the marine environment. The S prong would look at diversity issues, reputational values, how we are impacting workers' rights and safety on fishing vessels. And G would be looking at things like bribery and governance. These are all different ways now firms are evaluated, and by the way, going to be required to report under upcoming US law and currently under new European law as well. Investors matter a lot in this space. So using ESG metrics, a business or an individual might engage in sustainable investing. What does this mean? Well, if I'm going to invest in, say, a commercial fishing fleet or a commercial shipping fleet, I might want information about their energy efficiency and use of fossil fuels, because I might think that that has long-term financial risk. If I want to invest in a large food company where seafood is a large part of their portfolio, I want to be able to look down their supply chain to make sure they're contracting with fishing vessels that don't use slave labor, that they're contracting with fishing vessels who use certain fishing practices that don't result in significant bycatch. So sustainable investing is a part of this ESG space, which may impact the future of many animals in our marine environment. Just so you know, there might be another sort of phrase that you hear, the triple bottom line, sort of people, profit, and planet. This is often a term often used by business. I think the one difference here is profit for the company perhaps takes precedent over economic welfare for all the stakeholders in the community. But at the end of the day, I think what you see going on is that companies themselves and investors, both voluntarily and mandatorily, are taking account of these ESG factors because it has impacts on our environment, but also for their long-term financial bottom line. And so how do we foster sustainable business? So one is just we should be aware of this traditional regulatory perspective. If we look back at these public laws that were passed, a lot of them might include technology-based or health effect standards. That's what you see in the Clean Water Act or the Magnuson-Stevens Act. These standard-setting prescriptive regulations. Sometimes we might have bans, right? Like the Ocean Dumping Act, which prohibits certain ocean dumping within the United States. But with the challenges that public environmental law has faced, we then in the 1980s saw a move towards more neoliberal legislation. The idea that we're not going to make you set standards or have emissions limits, but we'll use more market-based mechanisms or informational regulations like disclosure as a way to change corporate behavior to help this sort of free market environmentalism. And some of you might see this in other areas of law, cap and trade programs as it relates to carbon impacts, or perhaps the USDA organic food labeling. In the context of private environmental governance, which can foster sustainable business, one example might be eco-labels. A lot of you, when you might, if you eat meat or you eat fish and you want to buy some fish sticks in the frozen food section, maybe Alaskan pollock would be a common one, you might see this MSC certified sustainable label, right? As a way that these are private certification mechanisms to increase sustainability in the marketplace. Outside the marine context, you might see your LEED certified building. So this is a way that companies and third-party organizations are certifying that perhaps they're performing better in this sustainability space. Just going to grab a drink of water here. So we talked a little bit about public law and then maybe the gaps in public law. And I've tried to give you a little bit of basic overview of what sustainable business law and ESG might look like. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions about, say, ESG litigation or greenwashing litigation and how that might impact this aquatic space. But now in particular, and I think this is the important part of the talk, if you will, how do we apply these sustainable business and ESG principles, which have evolved as a result of gaps in public environmental law? How do we apply them to the marine space? So how do sustainable business concepts relate to this marine space? Well, one way to think about it is that the entire marine environment itself is a blue economy. It encompasses many economic activities, renewable energy, fisheries, maritime transport, tourism, waste management. Together, all of these components comprise the blue economy, valued about $3.5 trillion annually. So, 2.5% of global GDP. Then we can see how this works in the sustainable business space, right? We might have sustainable investing with green and blue bonds. The blue economy has investing potential. Blue bonds has developed as one form of sustainable investment tool. Blue bonds emerged around 2018, 10 years after green bonds. So green bonds are bonds whose proceeds finance environmentally or climate-friendly green projects. And between 2015 and 2016, green bond issuance doubled to $81 billion and surpassed $1 trillion in 2020. Blue bonds are similar to green bonds, except that the proceeds are used to finance marine and ocean-based projects exclusively. Projects dealing with waste management, energy production, coastal ecotourism. So infrastructure which might be more sustainable for our oceans. Investing in this economy is crucial. The ocean is the largest heat sink on the planet, absorbing 90% of excess heat caused by climate change. Coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrass meadows They sequester a lot of carbon per year. And while blue bonds are not part of regulatory principles like green bonds, I think there's a lot of opportunities here to think about what investment and strategic investment in the blue economy might look like. There are also opportunities to create sustainable fisheries through the use of private environmental governance. In the United States, about 85% of the fish we consume is imported. And a lot of that fish, about $2.4 billion worth, is derived from illegal, unreported, or unregulated fishing, which I meant was a gap earlier on. And so we can discuss these in more detail. So what might be some examples of environmental, social, and governance mechanisms that private entities are dealing with, separate from what's required from public environmental law? Well, there are anti-finning commitments, for example, like shark finning is the practice of cutting off a live shark's fins and throwing the rest of the animal back into the sea. And the fins are used in some countries as a key ingredient in shark fin soup. While shark finning is illegal in US waters, the concern is that it could be transported across international boundaries. And so there are a number of commitments by private entities, and there have been bills passed by many states, and 15 major corporations, Amazon, Hilton, Disney, 22 shipping companies have refused to transport and trade shark fins. Even companies like Grubhub have announced that they will not permit restaurants to offer shark fin products through its online food ordering service. We also care a lot about sustainable seafood sourcing. Private companies are working really hard to improving their fishing technology to minimize environmental degradation and bycatch. And I think one of the most exciting areas right now is traceability and verification for consumers. So if you buy a piece of seafood, do you know where it was caught, from what boat it was caught, how the boat was registered, and what the fishing practices were? So blockchain technology is being used to store this seafood sourcing data. And that is a fascinating project. I know there are even some startups as it relates to farming of fish within the marine space, even having cameras and radio frequency chips attached to the animals, so we know where the seafood is sourced from. There's also a concern about labor standards. There are many public-private partnerships where public entities are working with NGOs and companies in an effort to increase labor standards on fishing vessels, things like improving fire safety policies, making sure there's no bribery or coercion on the vessels, to make sure that all individuals working on the ship have some sort of personal flotation device and that they wear them at all times, because it's a very difficult practice. And we want it to be safe for the individuals that are working. Another important aspect of fostering sustainable fisheries, to the extent that's possible, is that companies act sustainable through the entire supply chain. So when a company is contracting down their supply chain, what are the terms in those supply contracts? So, for example, some seafood companies have refused to purchase from any vessel that is found to have finned in any of the previous 2 years of their since the contract was signed. So, we're not going to buy from this company if you've engaged in shark finning. Nestle has banned transshipment at sea. So you can't have a situation where there is a boat that's engaged in some illegal fishing or not best practices, and they just transfer their seafood to another ship so it can be taken to market. And some companies are beginning to publish the list of their seafood fishing zones and vessels. And so we have more information about their supply chain, and there's greater transparency to see what's going on. Finally, eco-labeling. If any of you been to the grocery store, creating a sustainable fishery can be difficult. There are all sorts of claims on our products like green and all natural and organic and sustainable. The FTC does regulate claims that are made through its FTC green guides. Actions can be brought for unfair trade practices under federal law and state consumer protection statutes. So to the extent that there are products being sold in the market which claim to be sustainable, that is not necessarily the case, in which case consumers can bring a lawsuit against these companies for the claims that they're making. This is why a number of businesses engage in and have third-party certification for their products. The idea then is that provide verification and more consumer certainty as to what's going on. Of all the ones here, you're probably most familiar with the MSC label that I brought up before, but there's also GSSI. This is a public-private partnership with the goal to turn seafood into a driver for good, to preserve the oceans for future generations. MSC, I mentioned, and here are some other examples. I want to leave some time for Q&A. There are also commitments not directly related to fisheries management that can also help problems in the marine space. For example, since 2014, the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies program has helped companies reduce the environmental impact of their shipping practices off the coast of California. It's a voluntary incentive program, which recognizes and gives financial awards to shipping companies based on the percent of distance traveled by their vessels when reducing speed, which is, if you reduce the speed, that's better for our marine environment. And also, there's also some self-interest involved with a lot of shipping practices. There's an incentive for many shipping companies to become more fuel efficient, to reduce bycatch, because that can increase, doing otherwise would increase expenses for the company. As a result of pressure from stakeholders, including consumers, a number of companies have begun to address and make public commitments to ending plastic waste. Companies like Coca-Cola, Nestle, P&G are among the companies that have announced targets to reduce their plastic footprints and transition to products that contain more recycled content and are themselves recyclable. And as we all know, that plastic in the ocean environment is a huge concern. So I'm now happy to, I talked for about 30 minutes. I'm happy now to take any questions you might have, and I'll pause. I'll stop sharing my slide. I'm happy to answer any questions to talk about how private environmental governance, eco-labeling, ESG might interact with businesses working in the marine environment, and what those impacts might be for our aquatic life and marine mammals.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that very informative talk. Again, attendees, please put any questions you have in and I will convey them to Jason. I had a question, Jason. Do you have any sense that all of these public and private efforts are having an effect, are being successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer, right, is some are and some aren't. I think going forward, I'm very optimistic that more of them will be more beneficial. And the reason is what we see going on in the greenwashing litigation space and what we see going on in terms of mandatory reporting for ESG impacts. So before, companies were making claims like we're sustainable, or we're going to reduce our plastic by this amount by 2025, or we're going to be carbon neutral by 2035. And there wasn't a lot of, they could make those claims, but not necessarily back them up. And what you're seeing in the ESG and greenwashing litigation space, both under federal law, under the FTCA, and under state consumer protection law, is consumers are saying, wait, you made this claim. I bought your product because you made this claim. You're not doing what you said you're going to do, and therefore you're liable, right? So as you said, I'm going to improve my fishing practices, but you don't, you're now subject to significant liability. Now, I think what's fascinating is investors are beginning to realize that sustainability is material to the financial decision to invest. And so now anytime a company in their sustainability report makes claims about their fishing practices or the reduction of carbon footprint, investors are relying on that. So venture capitalists, institutional investors, private equity. And if those are inaccurate, now investors are going to file suit under the Securities Act and say, I relied on this statement in your fancy color glossy sustainability report, and you didn't do that. And that impacts my bottom line, because I think in the future, the companies that don't engage in certain fishing practices, the companies that have a low carbon footprint, the companies that don't use slave labor on their fleets, those are going to be the most valuable companies. And I think then the third component is under the new SEC proposed rules about carbon disclosure, but even the more broad rules that are coming down in the European Union, where companies are required to disclose their E, S, and G criteria, that then if those disclosures are inaccurate, they're subject to enforcement by national government regulators. And so there's a real now financial risk in terms of penalties from not only consumers and investors, but also national governments in terms of what these companies are doing. So in that way, I do think it's important. I guess the final thing is, I think there is some low-hanging fruit for companies where companies want to know more about their supply chains, and they want greater control from their suppliers and their fishing vessels in particular. And so the technology that you're seeing with blockchain and things like that, it allows them to have greater control, which they like. And I think there is some advantage for the informational desire from the company sort of linking up to what we'd also desire as consumers.
Who would be the biggest opponents to this kind of movement towards sustainability and eco-consciousness and so on?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the beginning.
What are the challenge? What's distance to this more sustainable business practices and so on? Who would be opposing that effort to protect marine life and so on?
So there's a lot of opponents, right? There's a lot of opponents. So I can give you some examples. So one opponent is for any investor that has a short-term time horizon. So if you're an older individual facing retirement, and there are some companies that engage in unsustainable practices, fishing practices. There are some companies that engage in heavy use of fossil fuels, for example. My short-term investment in those companies might be quite high, and I might get a lower rate of return on a more sustainable company. So you do see lawsuits now by some clients of institutional investors, state workers in a large pension fund, that are suing, for divestment from certain, some individuals might consider unsustainable companies. So that's one example. I'm trying to think of a second example. I mean, what Furton comes to mind is, there's currently this ideological discourse about, ESG and sustainable business, and I guess the objection is by some people say that these issues of sustainability are not material to the investor. I think in some cases that's just wrong. If you're a commercial real estate owner, the idea that climate change doesn't create a material risk to your investment is just not correct. If you are Coca-Cola and you rely on fresh water, the idea that water quality and quantity issues aren't material to the investor is just wrong. And if you are a business whose business is to use any part of the blue economy, like a fishery, the idea that making that fishery sustainable in the long term isn't in the financial interest of the company is, I think, incorrect. I think it is a more challenge on some of the social and governance components. For example, some people will say that diversity, equity, inclusion issues, while important to the culture of a company, maybe don't impact the financial impacts of a company. So that's an argument have that made as well. The response to that is, well, actually, there's data to show, for example, that greater gender equity on corporate boards actually leads to greater financial importance. So that is another way. It might sort of those are in favor and not in favor of this sort of sustainable business. See, Maggie dropped off for a second, but looks like she's coming back. You're back.
I'm back. What did I miss?
No, I just finished answering your question.
Okay. You had a list of so many different federal acts that have an impact on the marine environment. And is there a lack of coordination among the different agencies that administer these, or are they pretty much all on the same page?
Boy, that's a great question. My student who I'm working on with this, Brianna Grimes, she does her fellowship next year with NOAA. Maybe she can help answer that question. I do think greater coordination does need to exist between the agencies that are concerned with the economic well-being of the country and the environmental well-being of the country. There could be more cross-pollination, certainly that way. NOAA is within the Department of Commerce, so perhaps that helps. But when you're dealing with any major, federal bureaucracy, I think there are always challenges of ebb and flows. But that's a great question. Perhaps that can be a law review article for one of the students. It's one of the students watching.
Sounds like a good idea. Attendees I guess you have the ability to put a question in the Q&A or in the chat. So I'm not seeing anything. Brett, are there any questions coming in that I'm not seeing? Okay, I have a question.
Go right ahead.
What role do the states have to play?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So I can answer that a few ways. So, for example, the state of California has just created their own mandatory ESG disclosure requirements. And California's done this before with things like Cal Prop 50, where you have to have a warning label for any sort of carcinogen. So I do think that states are going to require disclosures from corporate entities to explain and disclose what they're doing in the sustainability space. That's one example. The second is, to the extent companies are making claims that are deceiving us about their practices, so that they're saying their seafood is sustainable and it's not. They're saying they're engaged in certain fishing practices or they're not. You are already seeing lots of consumer litigation in this space, especially in New York and California. And so I think there are real opportunities there for the plaintiffs bar to bring cases against companies that are making greenwashing claims that aren't true at all. And then I think the third part is, in light of recent Supreme Court decisions, like West Virginia versus EPA, which talks about the major questions doctrine, and Sackett, which reduced federal jurisdiction of wetlands, which might make 50 to 80% of our country's wetlands now non-jurisdictional from the federal government. I think we are going to look more to state governments to protect our freshwater ecosystems, so our navigable waterways, our rivers, our streams, our lakes. Some states have already passed legislation to gain jurisdictional control, so wetlands won't be filled in, and to protect those aquatic environments. But there's a real concern that some of the states won't act. And I think also in light of recent Supreme Court jurisprudence, it's an open question about whether the Supreme Court will narrow federal protection under other federal statutes, in particular, something like the Endangered Species Act. You can imagine an aquatic species that only exists in one state, therefore it's not subject to interstate commerce. And so you might see an overruling of previous cases that allow the Endangered Species Act to protect those organisms. That may no longer be the case, in which case states would have to come in to protect the wildlife in those freshwater aquatic ecosystems.
I'm not getting any questions through the chat or the Q&A. If you're not able to use that system, attendees, please send me an email at mlivings@depaul.edu.
It looks like Professor Randy Abate might have a question.
That's great. For other non-participant attendees, my email address is mlivings, MLIVINGS @depaul.edu, and I'll try to get some questions that way. Randy, what is your question?
Thanks for a great presentation, Jason. The question is, in this effort to combat greenwashing, the consumers are going to rely on these certifications that are supposed to build confidence in the legitimacy of what's being conveyed. And is there any reason to be, as a consumer, more confident in government-based certifications like USDA organic versus something from a private association like MSC? And is there a concern that industry itself might co-opt those private certifiers?
There's definitely a concern that industry might co-opt those private certifiers, right? Because the industries are clients, right? They're paying clients in order to get certified. Having done a lot of fieldwork research on labels, I find that there are definitely labels fall into sort of three camps, right? One of the labels that are like really just, they're really just owned by the companies. There's a great California case where a chemical company had a cleaning spray and it said certified green by the Green Alliance, but the Green Alliance was just a department within the company, right? So that's like the worst case scenario. I think you're seeing less of that because the FTC green guides have said that that's not okay. Then you have some eco labels where the companies are paying clients. I'm thinking now of like Krav, which is the major organic label in Sweden. They have real standards. They work with the companies to meet those standards, but they intentionally design those standards to be like completely achievable. So, I don't know where you would fall on that, right? If you create a standard, all the companies are like, hey, if we work a little harder, we can achieve these standards and be better. And that's sort of like the goal of that certification label, right? And they improve the standards, of course, over time. And then there are and that's not to suggest that it's not independent, right? It's just a different level. And then there are some standards, more newer standards that are really trying to, push the envelope, right? That it should be really difficult to get this standard. And eventually there might be a consumer market for it. I think there are some advantages of government standards. It's, then, goes through notice and comment rulemaking. We know what the standards mean, but not everybody agrees, right? Not everybody likes that the government has designed organic. And if you ask anybody what organic means, it's certainly not what's decided by federal law. And of course, just because you see an organic label doesn't mean it's, by the way, if anybody sees the USDA organic label, it doesn't mean it's 100% organic. It could be 95% organic and still have that label. So people don't know what it means even in that scenario. I do think at the end of the day, there's a lot of promise for certification mechanisms. And I think government action requiring verification to make claims is a beneficial way to do that. So I think even though there are problems, it's unclear to me what the alternative is if we're unwilling to pass public law, right? So the theoretical question here is, why are we putting the onus on the consumer here? If something is bad, if we know we want everybody to be certified to this level, why doesn't the law just require that? And that's a failure of public environmental law. So, if we want to create these certification standards, why we're not using, where we're not trawling the bottom of the ocean with large nets, or why we can't just throw plastic in the ocean, like, we should just have more rigorous public law. To rely on consumers to make a better choice and to rely on companies which care about short-term financial interests, that seems problematic.
Any other questions, Randy? Not at this point.
Great answer.
I'm going to continue with my question since I do not see any from the attendees. So my next question is, can we afford all this? So if we stop dumping plastic in the ocean, we use humane fishing practices, we protect workers on vessels and give them better conditions, what's the price of fish at the end of the day? And can we afford
I mean, that's a great question. So here, I'll be honest, I'm not going to give my answer. It's what I think Professor Mike Vandenberg's answer would be. He's a professor at Vanderbilt. He wrote the seminal article called Private Environmental Governance, which is, as demand increases for a certain type of product, price goes down. So, the example he uses is Walmart buying a lot of LED lights, which, substantially lower the price. So, we used to have light bulbs and we buy these expensive curly CFLs, and now we can buy LEDs very inexpensively. Right. So if we create a choice of design or way we would like a product or way we would like, fish to be caught or things like that, eventually the price will go on down. At the same time, maybe something should be expensive. We are importing a lot of cheap seafood. People are not following the Eat Lancet diet. America, if you read books by like Paul Greenberg, American Catch and Force Fish, Americans export all their good fish to Asia. We can develop a more sustainable diet. It should be costly to have a healthy environment and to eat better, so we can pay living wages to people so they can also afford more expensive things. So I think there, the economic engine can sometimes handle increased prices, right? If we increase wages and we're understanding and we're creating greater value. And I think that's easier to do in maybe the durable context, right? Because, we can buy t-shirts and clothes and fast fashion and we throw them away, but maybe we could spend more and just have a suit that lasts forever. How does that work in the marine environment? I think is a little bit more challenging.
So if the U.S. is doing maybe everything it can to protect the marine environment, which it probably isn't at this point, but if we get there, what is the effect of other countries not doing the same? Because the oceans are everywhere.
Yeah, I think in the ocean context, it's quite difficult. Especially because you have limited jurisdictional control, outside your coastal zone of your individual countries. We're already seeing that with now, as you have more ice-free areas in the Arctic, right? There's pressure and competition, so that's a real challenge. I mean, in the absence of public international law, which is very challenging. I mean, the United States still hasn't ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. That is where an area where private environmental governance and these sustainable business practices, I think, play a role. These multinational companies have fishing fleets all over the world. They have factories all over the world. And so we do rely on them to create these private norms to increase behavior, regardless of what local domestic law is. And we can demand of our companies that sell products in the United States that when they contract with individuals down their supply chain that they have that they engage in certain practices, otherwise they won't contract with them. So one of the roles of future ESG lawyers is to make sure those provisions are in the supply chain contracts for the major companies.
Do you think consumers, by and large, are more sophisticated about the origins of the things they buy, and they demand these kinds of things, or are consumers somewhat indifferent?
I think the answer is both. So I think the data would show that consumers care about something sometimes. So for example, we know the data shows that consumers, if they think things are more healthy for them, they're more likely to buy them. So consumers buy organic often because they perceive it as more healthy, when probably the real benefits are the benefits to the natural environment. We also know consumers are more likely to engage in sustainable behavior when they think it's cool to do so, or they think they'll be shamed for not doing so. So, in a paper I wrote with a colleague about eco-labeling, and I have another article about greenwashing and seafood eco-labeling. The idea is that when you go to the grocery store, you get a black or a green shopping cart, and you only get the green shopping cart if you agree to buy only the sustainable and organic products. And like, what would that do, as you walked around the grocery store? So public pressure can be quite important when it comes to these issues as well.
Wonderful. All right. Any other questions for Jason?
Well,
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was really a joy to present, and hopefully I'll get back to Chicago and get to see you in person.
That would be wonderful. It'd be great to see you. Brad?
There is one more question.
There is one more question. Okay. Ken asks, what would enforcement look like if there were any violations of agreed upon standards? Would there be penalties?
So there wouldn't be any public penalties. Certainly, private organizations could agree that there would be penalties amongst themselves for failure to agree to a certain practice in a private certification scheme or private norms, right? You could pay a penalty to the group. You could maybe not be allowed to engage in a particular entity, but there would not be unfortunately, any public enforcement for violation of any sort of private environmental governance norm.
All right. Thank you again, Jason.
Thank you so much.
I hope to see you soon.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. I think we're going to move on to our next speaker. And before we get to her, apparently there was a mix-up through Eventbrite in the link that was sent to the attendees, and we do apologize that. I believe Brett has worked that out, so sorry for any inconvenience you experienced. Our next speaker is Dr. Lori Marino. She's a neuroscientist and adjunct professor of animal studies at New York University. She's the founder and president of the Whale Sanctuary Project and executive director of the Kimmela Center for Scholarship-Based Animal Advocacy. She has published over 140 peer-reviewed scientific articles, book chapters, and magazine articles. So please join me in welcoming Lori Marino.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me. I am going to share my screen so we can get started. Let's see, here we are. Okay. And let's see. Slideshow. There we go. Great. Thank you. I hope everyone can see that. Again, thank you very much for having me. We're going to talk about something very, very different than the previous talk. And that is legal protections for whales who are kept in captivity and the science behind it. We all know that there was a recent death of a very well-known orca in captivity, Tokate, also known as Lolita. She died in August at the age of 57, and she was at the Miami Seaquarium. She was captured when she was 4 years old, and the cause of death after the necropsy was done was that she died of multiple conditions. But I want to argue that the real cause of her death was captivity. Now, in order to understand a little bit, very briefly, about what orcas experience in captivity, we need to understand who they are. They are highly social animals with very large, complex brains. They have cultural traditions, different dialects, very long juvenile periods, lifelong social bonds. They actually are matrilineal, and they live in very complex social networks and have sophisticated communication abilities. So that is a nutshell characterization of a very intelligent, very socially complex, wide-ranging mammal. Let's see. Well, trying to. There we go. So to give you an idea of the scope of the problem, there are about 55 orcas kept in concrete tanks around the world. There are 18 in the United States, all of them at SeaWorld, one in Argentina, one in Russia. There are actually 3 now in Spain. I neglected to change that 4 to 3 because one of the orcas passed away just 2 weeks ago. There are some in France, and well, actually in France, the orca passed away. There are about 15 or 20 in China and about 7 in Japan. So altogether, there are about 55 orcas living in concrete tanks. And just to broaden the scope of this issue, there are about 3,500 cetaceans, meaning dolphins and whales and porpoises, living in marine parks around the world. On the left, you see the beluga whale, on the right, bottlenose dolphins. So this is a pretty large problem, and although the United States doesn't take these animals from the wild anymore, there are many other countries that still do. Most of them are in Asia, Russia, and those areas where they take them out of the wild and put them into captivity. So one of the things that's really important that I always think about is the importance and the power of law, either in litigation or legislation, policy creation, just any advocacy. It largely, not entirely, but largely depends upon the soundness of the scientific evidence for one's claims. So to put everything in perspective now, the question is, what is the evidence that cetaceans, like orcas, just don't belong in marine parks? So we're going to look at the science or the evidence that is brought to bear on that issue. Now, the first thing we can look at is just how long they live, lifespan statistics. Most orcas live between 50 and 60 years. They can live to 100. But captive orcas of either sex rarely live past their mid-20s. 92% of all the orcas held at SeaWorld, which is a decent place in terms of veterinary care have died by the age of 25 years. So they just don't live as long when they're at marine parks. Now, if you look at survivorship, you also see something similar. You see that although there have been improvements, survival to sexual maturity and reproductive senescence still in captivity remains poor compared to free-ranging orcas. And when you look at infant mortality statistics, it's really striking. For instance, of the 103 orcas who have been born in captivity globally since 1985, most of them are dead. 73 have already died, with 48 dying in the first year. And one has to ask oneself about this, because if orca birth rates and infant mortality rates are even slightly better in captivity, shouldn't they be a lot better? I mean, we're talking about no predators, protection, veterinary care, and feeding. So the best that these facilities can do is bring the infant mortality rate to what it is in the wild. Let's look at some of the health issues that befall orcas in tanks. Many of them die of opportunistic infections. That is, infections that are due to pathogens that really cause sickness when the immune system is weakened. And we know that the immune system is weakened when an animal is under chronic stress. Common causes of death for orcas and other cetaceans in captivity are pneumonia, gastrointestinal disease, meningitis, encephalitis, candidiasis. Now, orcas in the wild die of these same diseases, but the question is, why are the ones in captivity dying of those diseases? One of the reasons is that many of these incidents of death from opportunistic infections are due to prophylactic over-medicating with antibiotics and antifungals, so that there's a lot of antibiotic resistance that goes on. And they just do this by putting antibiotics and antifungals in the fish, the dead fish that they feed them, and drop them in their mouth. And so by the time an individual might get some sort of a bad case of pneumonia or a lung infection, they are already resistant, and it's very difficult to treat them. When you look at the behavior, we see a lot of issues with captive orcas that are called stereotypies and dental disease. Now, stereotypies are something that it's a behavior that's repetitive. It doesn't really have any purpose. We see it in humans. We see it in all kinds of species who are under chronic psychological stress or mentally disturbed in some way. Orcas in captivity tend to bite on hard tank surfaces and gates, and the majority of them have teeth that look like this in the picture. Now, there are no teeth in that lower jaw of that captive orca, and that's because he or she has ground them down to the gums. It's 24% of captive orcas in the United States and Spain exhibit wear, major to extreme mandibular tooth wear, right down to the gums. And what this does is provide an entry point for pathologies and systemic disease. And we also see a lot of self-injurious and other abnormal behaviors. For instance, we see, here are 3 examples. On the left is Hugo. He was an orca who was captured from the wild when he was a baby. He was in the tank with Tokate, Lolita. but he continually bashed his head against the side of the tank, and he eventually died of a brain aneurysm. In the middle is Morgan. She's a young female who is living in Laurel Parque, Spain. And if you can tell from this photo, she's not actually in the tank, in the water. She's on the side. And the reason is because she's beached herself on the cement because she's being harassed by several male orcas in the tank. And in tanks, there's nowhere to go to get away to disperse aggression. So she's actually does this quite frequently to get away from them. She had a calf not too long ago who eventually died. And on the right is Corky and Candu, who were in a show at SeaWorlds, and they collided. Candu bled out, as you can see, in front of her calf and in front of the audience, and she died. And although this is a particularly dramatic example, there are many examples of self-harm and hyperaggression occurring in the tanks that just don't happen in the wild. So in summary, captive orcas first don't live as long as in the wild, despite what SeaWorld will tell you. They die more often than in the wild, and they suffer from infectious diseases due to immune system dysfunction. They also exhibit abnormal behaviors, including stereotypies, self-harm, and hyperaggression. And it leads to a question that I'd like to leave you with, and I'd like to think about, and that is this, that really, can adaptation to 52 million years in the ocean be circumvented by an artificial, anthropocentric, impoverished environment? And I suggest to you that the answer is absolutely no, that there is some things that just don't go together, and one of them are orcas in concrete tanks performing in marine parks. So I'm leaving a lot of time for questions, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of the things we know about this issue. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I have a comment from an attendee, Rebecca, who says everyone should watch Blackfish.
Well, I can't argue with you there. I had the opportunity to be in the film, and it really is an eye-opener because it was the first time that the public got a chance to really see what happens behind the scenes at places like SeaWorld, where everything is kind of nice and sanitized for their visitor.
Right.
But it really is not.
You mentioned the whale sanctuary project. Is it possible to build a sanctuary for whales?
Yeah, absolutely. And we are at the Whale Sanctuary Project. It's an organization I founded in 2016, and we are creating a sanctuary for orcas and beluga whales in Nova Scotia. And we're pretty close to completing all of the environmental analyses and the permitting and all of that that's necessary to get the lease to finally start building. And I think it's really important that sanctuaries become something that multiply, because it is an alternative to what we see when we go to a place where the animals are performing.
Right.
These animals can't be dumped back in the ocean. So they need human care because they just don't know how to survive. They don't have a social group or pod to go back to. But what we can do is give them a more natural environment with all of the inputs that their brain and their body really need to thrive.
And what does a sanctuary look like? Is it a space in the ocean?
Our sanctuary will be a netted off area in a beautiful bay, about 100 acres. which is orders of magnitude greater than, the largest tank in the world. We will provide a home for orcas and belugas in separate areas. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that's really important for these animals is space. And there will be enough space in a facility like this so that they can disperse, which is the natural way that they keep aggression down. When there's nowhere to go and they're all on top of each other, you see things like what I showed you.
And
And I'm sorry.
so it's a netted off area that fishermen can't enter, and
Nobody can enter. It's protected. We'll have 24/7 care. But it is in the ocean. It's in a bay. There'll be fish, the plants. It is an ocean environment that actually I like to describe it as human care plus. So it's all the goodies you get in a place where you have a veterinarian and we'll feed them and we'll protect them. But what they get is something much closer to the kind of environment that they need to stay healthy and to actually thrive. We'll promote their autonomy, their ability to explore. There'll be things to actually explore. The tanks that they're currently kept in are nothing more than impoverished concrete cells. They will be able to actually have something, be in an environment that has something of interest to them. And that's very important for them.
I have a question from Kelly. How can we stop countries like Russia from kidnapping them and selling them to China?
Oh gosh. It's very difficult because the thing is that while there are many facilities, marine parks around the world who are sort of ramping down in terms of keeping these kinds of animals for display, China is where it's ramping up. And why? Because they never had these kinds of things, but they look to the United States and they see that, oh, look how lucrative and popular SeaWorld is. They want that too. And so they are coming online. There's 82 marine parks in China with dolphins and whales. And what they do is they order them from Russia. Russia goes and catches them and brings them in. And if they die, they just go get more. So this is not only an animal rights and welfare issue. This is a conservation issue because there's absolutely no regulation of or accounting for what capturing these animals does to their populations.
Attendees, please put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Thank you. Do you think the public interest in these kinds of SeaWorld shows is diminishing in the US?
Yeah, I think it is. I really do. People are starting to realize, they may not feel that good about paying to see an animal like an orca or a beluga whale in a small tank performing. And I think the new generation really gets that quite a bit. But obviously, it's still something that is lucrative for these parks. I mean, the bottom line here is, one, if we can get them to stop breeding, making more individual animals who are living in captivity, take some of them and bring them to sanctuaries. So we have to build more sanctuaries and then have that be a way to move towards a more respectful relationship with these animals, which I think kids get that they want that.
Let's see. There's a question coming in here. Is this similar, do you think, to our confinement of land animals in zoos? Is it the same kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the welfare science, you see some real parallels, especially with large animals like elephants.
Mhm.
We published some papers on that, looking at orcas and elephants. There's certain characteristics that wild animals have that make them really vulnerable to the stresses of captivity.
Mhm.
If they have big brains and they're smart, if they travel, if they have the kind of diet where they need to hunt, where they have complex social lives. I mean, all these things make it very difficult for to be replicated in a marine park. That
Mhm.
elephants suffer from the same kinds of issues, poor health, uh, high mortality, shorter lifespans, and the same thing with many other animals. So you have to ask yourself, if they're being fed and they have veterinary care 24/7 and they're in clean water, what's killing them? And I
Mhm.
think the answer is the fact that they're not in the right environment for
Mhm.
what they need,
Right.
because they evolved in a very, very different environment, and not only physical, but also social.
Right. I was aware of a case near Chicago in Cook County involving Rocky the coyote, who was
Mm.
confined in a forest preserve in a
Yeah,
very small area. And
yeah,
there was a movement last year to have him released to a sanctuary in Colorado, and there was so much opposition to it. And the forest preserve kept saying, well, he's an ambassador animal. And did anyone ask him?
no,
But
nobody asked him to be an ambassador. There is opposition because, from a psychological perspective, if you are keeping these animals in zoos and marine parks and it's not good for them, you have to do some soul searching and you have to come to
yeah.
the realization that, gee, what I've been doing maybe not the best and I can do better. And to get there, you have to really do a lot of reflection.
Mhm.
But the bottom line is that as long as people buy tickets to see these animals, it'll continue as a business model.
I have a question from Dennis. What financial incentive does SeaWorld have to release orcas to sanctuaries?
Well, there's a couple of things. It's a really good question. So why would SeaWorld ever want to release any of their animals to sanctuaries? Well, right now they say they don't want to, but they may if there's enough public opposition to seeing these animals in tanks.
Mhm.
They can pivot. And, we maintain that this is not about shutting down SeaWorld. It's about working with them to
Mhm.
shift business model, shift the way we relate to these animals. And so they don't have to see this as an existential threat.
Mhm.
Um, they may, but it's really not the case.
An attendee asks, how do you plan to pressure SeaWorld to give up their orcas? All the bad publicity and they're still a business? Question mark.
Oh, we're not pressuring SeaWorld. SeaWorld knows we're here. SeaWorld knows we want their whales, but there are other facilities around the world, and we have several facilities who are interested in talking to us about bringing their whales to our sanctuary. So there's a facility, there are 2 beluga whales in South Korea who may come to our facility. We've been talking with them for quite some time. There's 35 beluga whales in Canada. There's 3 in Taiwan. And then there is the family of orcas living in Antibes. And they are being transferred to Japan. And we're trying to see if there's a path forward for them instead of going to Japan, where they're going to get broken up as a family, come and be with us in the facility. So SeaWorld is not the only game in town, but I do think that eventually they're going to follow suit. They just created a new sanctuary, a new marine park in Dubai, and there's no orcas. And I think that's a signal. I think that's a signal that says that, yeah, they're trying to do something.
I have a question from Ken. Are governments catering to tourism industries that claim to generate revenue in communities? How can advocacy look to counter that?
Yeah, governments do cater to tourism industries. One of the things that can be done is to really put a lot of pressure on tourism to not promote these facilities. So there are a lot of places now that a lot of cruise lines, for instance, airlines who have pledged and do not promote travel to see captive animals in places like SeaWorld around the world. And I think it is about the monetary pressure and the fact that, you know, there is a substantial and growing number of people who want to feel good about what they do. And when they go on vacation, and I think they can be receptive to doing something, you know, it's sort of, which, you know, our previous speaker talked about, people want to feel that they are doing the right thing, that they are good people. and yeah, and so there is the psychology there is poised to change, I think.
That's good to hear. Thank you very much, Laurie. Really appreciate your talk. We're going
my
to
pleasure.
We're going to take a 5-minute break now. So we'll be offline for a couple minutes. So see you back here in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks again to our first 2 speakers. And now we're going to move on to Professor Randall Abate. Hi, Randy.
Hello.
Randall Abate joined the George Washington University Law School as Assistant Dean for Environmental Law Studies in July of 2022. From 2018 to 2022, he served as the inaugural Rexnitz Family and Urban Coast Initiative Endowed Chair in Marine and Environmental Law and Policy at Monmouth University in New Jersey. Throughout his career, he has taught and lectured on domestic and international environmental law, climate change law and justice, ocean and coastal law, constitutional law, torts, and animal law in more than 25 countries on 6 continents. Please welcoming Professor Abate.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It's wonderful to reconnect with DePaul's Animal Law program. I have fond memories of my visit that you and Brett arranged for me in March, and really grateful for this invitation and this very impressive range of speakers you've compiled for this event. So I'm going to share my slides. Okay, so just want to give a heads up that there are some graphic images in these slides for those who are sensitive. So my presentation is focused on the practice of shark finning primarily, but it's also more broadly concerned about the challenge of protecting sharks more generally in the marine environment, and how there is a failure of existing laws to address a crisis of really tremendous proportions from a variety of factors, but shark finning is certainly a leading culprit in the demise of shark populations around the world. And so one angle that I'd like to offer as part of this presentation is the emerging area of rights of nature protections as an additional legal tool to help address this disturbing trend of loss of shark species around the world. So I want to give you a little bit of background on what shark finning entails, how there is certainly ample international and domestic law addressing the protection of sharks and addressing shark finning practices more particularly. And then I also want to introduce for you how the practice of shark finning is very much an intersectional issue in terms of governance. It's very much an environmental protection concern, and environmental laws are addressing it, but it's also a public morality concern, given how gruesome the practice is, very much of an animal welfare, animal rights concern. And then I'll introduce the rights of nature dimension of how rights of nature is very much at that intersection between traditional environmental law and animal welfare and rights, and how it's seeking to add another layer, another tool in the toolkit for protecting species and elements of nature in a more ambitious way. So also picking up on some of the themes in Jason's presentation, I did want to talk about how that private environmental governance piece, that promoting of public awareness to help blame and shame or inspire the private sector to do the right thing to avoid the perpetuation of these practices, is also very important in this space. So, as I mentioned, this is a topic that really rests at the juncture of environmental conservation and public morality. It's first important to note the very important role that sharks play in the marine environment, and how the conservation of ecosystem integrity is a principal objective of environmental laws, whether it be in the marine or terrestrial environment. And so there's certainly a kind of public bad rap that sharks have to overcome to be more widely embraced as a goal of environmental conservation in the marine environment. Certainly the polar bear has won the heart of the public as a cause that the public can rally around. But sharks are a little behind the polar bear in terms of the widespread appeal and awareness and receptivity to the plight of an ocean that is shark depleted. A huge environmental concern. And then also the idea of the public morality dimension of shark finning, and just how contrary it is to an exercise of compassion, how utterly senseless and brutal the practice is, and how that alone should inspire a termination, a global ban on the practice, despite the environmental conservation concerns that compound it. So this is just a rhetorical question. There's certainly more than just the obscene price associated with a bowl of shark fin soup. It is a cup of soup, bowl of soup, like any other in terms of volume, and yet this delicacy is priced at up to or over $100 per bowl. And to add insult to injury, it's utterly tasteless as well. And so it is really just kind of a symbol of status and tradition. And there are many similar cultural symbols and associated with status and tradition that over time became discontinued because they were quite harmful for a variety of reasons. So this idea of beyond the outrageous price of a bowl of shark fin soup, it is certainly the stakes are quite high when we talk about the role that sharks play as keystone species in the marine environment. And so I first wanted to note this distinction between shark finning and shark fishing. Certainly, as an animal rights proponent, I'm concerned with shark fishing as well as shark finning. But when you compare the two, certainly shark finning is the larger concern for the reasons noted on this slide. At least shark fishing, although there are degrees of inhumanity associated with many fishing techniques, at least it's a source of protein for some populations. I'm certainly not endorsing going out and having a shark steak for dinner tonight by any means, but it lacks that piece that shark finning has in terms of how wasteful shark finning is. And it also doesn't have the same degree of immorality that shark finning does. So rather than just harvesting the shark as a whole with shark finning, as Jason mentioned briefly earlier today, the practice is literally just lopping off the fins of sharks and throwing them defenseless back into the ocean, and to suffer horrible deaths on two levels. One is death by drowning is certainly a terrible death, and to compound that, sometimes before the drowning kills the sharks, they are all rendered defenseless to predators. So you either drown to death or you're eaten alive, or a combination of the two. It's just utterly immoral, and the scale at which it's done is quite shocking. So we're talking about 100 million sharks commercially harvested per year, and that figure is as scary as it sounds. That's literally 6 to 8% of the global population of sharks that are harvested per year. So that is clearly an unsustainable trajectory for not only the shark populations around the world, but the marine environment itself. When you think about the role that sharks play in the marine ecosystem, and shark finning is just utterly wasteful. It's a source of protein for some populations, and it is just discarded into the ocean. Bad for the economy and bad for populations that may rely on it as a source of protein. So the immorality piece is really a major concern, and that's starting to gain some traction in the animal rights movement, both domestically and internationally. That gruesomely inappropriate practices like this could form the foundation for at least some consensus on a national level, or preferably on an international level, regarding things that are simply intolerable regarding the treatment of animals. So internationally and outside the U.S., there's certainly protections that environmental law offers for sharks. We have the CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, listing shark species as one dimension of protection that sharks can benefit from, but it's really just nibbling at the edges when you're talking about just one shark species added to this comprehensive treaty regime. It's far better than nothing, but it's merely a pinprick on the overall problem. And likewise, the Convention on Migratory Species also protects some species under its regime. And that's, again, better than nothing, but the scope and imminence of the problem is far greater than this kind of approach, and nothing more. Shark sanctuaries also add some dimension of protection. Getting a ban on commercial fishing certainly is a big step in the right direction, but again, not nearly enough. And the fact that these environmental laws really have no reference to animal welfare or public morality is a severe limitation on how they ought to be framed in addressing a problem like shark finning. So at the federal and state level in the U.S., we're seeing that growing public morality concern infuse into this space, which is encouraging. Hot off the press, the Shark Sales Elimination Act this year is designed to target shark finning, which is very encouraging. And it is a kind of the final step in an evolution of shark fin laws in the country over a period of 2 decades, where there were progressively tighter restrictions on the practice. And this is kind of the third time's the charm kind of a outcome, which is definitely encouraging that efforts were made to build awareness about this concern and ultimately stricter regulation of it over time. The unfortunate reality about this victory is that the U.S. only accounts for about 1% of the global shark fin trade. So it's certainly doing its part, and the U.S. is a leader and in international environmental governance, not as much as it used to be or not as much as it should be, but certainly to the extent the U.S. gets a law on this kind of issue right, it can have that ripple effect of inspiring others to do the same, and that will take a larger bite out of the problem on a global scale. California also a leader. If California were a country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. So when California gets it right on environmental or animal rights and welfare concerns, that's also a big step forward for the global community. And in California, this law was actually challenged, addressing the shark fin trade, and it was the law was upheld, and there was a public morality animal welfare foundation for this law, not just an environmental protection focus to it. And so that was a big victory. So we're also seeing that there's related leverage to draw on in the animal rights context in other scenarios. So certainly the victory against Ringling Brothers and the use of mistreatment of elephants with bullhooks, very much of a grassroots success that rippled out into a national victory. And of course, SeaWorld, as you've just heard from Lori, the discontinuing use of orcas, in part due to litigation, in part due to the negative publicity from SeaWorld, from Blackfish, very positive outcome there. And then also on the litigation front with the habeas corpus petitions, spearheaded by the Non-Human Rights Project, for chimpanzees and most recently elephants. All of these efforts are building that sense of public morality as a focus for enhanced protection of animals that are mistreated in a variety of ways, whether it be captivity or shark finning. So then we also have the other intersections of environmental conservation and public morality. So one example was the bycatch concern associated with dolphins and the fishing of tuna, how dolphins were just on a wide scale basis bycatch in the efforts to fish tuna, and that was a major victory to ultimately engage in tuna fishing in a way that was dolphin sensitive, and that was a major victory for the sustainability of dolphin populations. And of course, drift net fishing bans are also very good in terms of how ultimately inhumane these walls of death are, in terms of how these large-scale commercial fishing operations are conducted, and the bycatch concerns and the inhumane practices. That's also another victory there. And then we had an international trade and environment scenario with the EU seals case, that it was certainly a victory where there was a recognition of public morals exception in an animal welfare context there. And that's another example of how different areas of law, different contexts, that they're all kind of coalescing around this momentum to recognize this intersection between environmental conservation and public morality as a way to move forward in addressing these challenges. And so rights of nature comes along, and it's the most recent development in this progression, and it's just been around for about a decade in the U.S. more or less, and around the world it's gaining traction, much more so than it is in the U.S., in Latin America, and in other countries around the world. But basically, it's this notion of recognizing the rights of elements of nature, whether it be species, animal species, or trees, or rivers, their right, their inherent value, their right to exist and flourish, and permitting lawsuits on behalf of these entities that have rights of nature protections when those rights are violated. So certainly adding an additional layer of protection beyond what we've seen in some of these examples of environmental and public morality, animal rights type efforts. This is an additional layer that can help promote the conservation of sharks in the face of all these threats in the marine environment. So there are efforts now that are encouraging, very recent efforts. Panama recently passed a law recognizing rights of sea turtles in a rights of nature framework. And then building on Lori's presentation again, this protection of the southern resident orcas in the Pacific Northwest. We've got a proclamation in Port Townsend, Washington, recognizing rights of nature protections for the orcas. And prior to that, there was recognition of rights of whales and dolphins in San Francisco and Malibu. So we're certainly seeing growing momentum for these practices, and there was a recent case at the intersection of animal protection and environmental conservation out of Ecuador involving Estrellita, the monkey, and that was also kind of another step in this recognition of the intersection of animal rights and environmental conservation concerns that used to live in separate camps, and now they're coalescing in a way that I feel really is a win-win for both movements. So certainly there has to be this combination of top-down advocacy and bottom-up pressure to really do the best we can on these issues. And I think the international space is very good with building consensus, not so good about enforcing the political will that is established, but certainly when you think about how far we've come with international human rights, it really originated with just this first step of recognizing what human rights ought to be recognized as protectable in the wake of World War II. And many years, half century later, a similar recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples. And these are mere declarations, but nonetheless a comparable declaration on animal rights and welfare that could address the practice of shark finning more explicitly would be a very big step forward. And ultimately, the Rio Declaration has had that effect on international environmental law. It was back in 1992, and many of the Rio Declaration principles are incorporated now into binding treaties of international environmental law. So the bottom-up advocacy also very important to raise awareness of the problem. That certainly has worked very well in the animal rights space. There is a concern, though, about when you have a conscientious public that the private sector is going to be more inclined, as we heard from Jason, to engage in greenwashing practices to appeal to the conscientious consumer. So there are efforts to manage that backlash, if you will, to litigate on the basis of alleged greenwashing, and that's certainly happening in a robust way in the animal rights space and in the environmental and even climate change space now. A new area of climate washing litigation is emerging as well. And then there's also the practical reality has to be always advanced as something that makes sense. That gelatin is certainly a substitute for what shark fin represents as a product, very similar to the texture and taste, non-existent taste of shark fin soup. And so building awareness on how that is the right way to go, celebrities can lead that charge, and that's happened. Both with Take a Pass on Chilean sea bass campaign was very effective that way. And in the context of shark fin soup, we've got Yao Ming and Jackie Chan speaking out. And ultimately that's effective public pressure. It also helps when the private sector embraces their outrage over an inappropriate practice. And so we've got an extensive list from the Animal Welfare Institute about countries, companies, and airlines that have embraced a ban on the shark fin soup industry. And then there's a really interesting documentary called Shark Bait about the shark fin soup process, and that features Chef Gordon Ramsay. So all of these efforts, very much like Blackfish, came to the cause of orcas in captivity and built awareness about that, and the concerns Lori raised about that. There always is significant value in building public awareness through effective communication and ultimately informing a public to advocate for the legal protections that are potentially available. And Rights of Nature, I suggest, is that next layer of advocacy that can certainly help address this daunting global challenge. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Randy. That was extremely interesting. There was a question for the prior speaker from Jenna, an aquatics veterinarian, and I'm sorry I did not get a chance to pose that. We had already signed off, and Lori has another commitment, so she is not around to answer that question. I apologize for that. Are there any questions for Randy Abate? His talk on shark finning. We're going to have a speaker a little bit later who actually does research on sharks, and that should be quite interesting. I guess I had a question about public morality and who defines what is public morality, or is there a consensus on that?
Yeah, there's certainly no one who's defining public morality, and I think that's, you know, it's been referenced as such in the WTO agreement as one basis on which an exception can be made to the way that the WTO prohibitions operate. So that came up in the EU seals case, where there was just an objection to the way in which seals were harvested, that they're clubbed and how they're ultimately how the pelts are ultimately harvested was considered just fundamentally inhumane from this sense of a public morality concern. But I think it's a very difficult concept to kind of reduce into a legal standard. It's fundamentally subjective, and I think that when we think about international human rights, I think that's probably the best parallel we have. That when the international human rights movement began in the wake of World War II, it was about recognizing things that we find intolerable as humans in terms of actions against other humans, and genocide was a clear no-brainer sort of starting point to say, this is something we will not tolerate. This is just fundamentally inappropriate, and law must respond in a way that this is prohibited. And so on the animal rights side, I think when you apply public morality in that way, it's shark finning is probably very high on most people's lists about, and I mean, unless you're part of a culture or a business that engages in the practice of shark fin production, soup production or consumption, it's kind of easy to garner that consensus that this is just fundamentally wrong. It doesn't matter whether you're from the US or India, where we can disagree about whether, you know, the cow is sacred or the dog and cat are sacred, but ultimately this is something that is fundamentally inhumane for a vast swath of the international community, and it's on the basis of that sort of sense of being immoral.
Mm-hmm. I have one question coming in from an attendee. How do you campaign for an animal that is not only not cute and fluffy, but also considered a symbol of fear and danger?
Yeah, I'm confident, and you'll probably hear more about this from Patrick when it comes to, raising consensus about shark conservation. You have to undo everything that my generation grew up with about our relationships to sharks. I mean, it's even earlier in my life, I was less inclined to swim in the ocean because of that movie. And certainly now, with all the other threats going on associated with climate change, and how sharks are ultimately displaced because of climate change related factors, you are much more likely to find a shark near you when you're out there enjoying the coastal environment. So there is, and it's not the shark's fault. It's not like they're these voracious predators seeking out vulnerable humans. It's this sense of there are a lot of other predators in the animal kingdom that are worshipped, like the lion, and ultimately there's not that kind of reverence and respect for sharks, and they play such a critical role as well as ecosystem engineers. So I think it really is about public information and education, and I certainly don't remember getting that. I wasn't a science aficionado in my high school and college years, but nonetheless, I don't remember getting the information about the critical role that sharks play in the marine environment until I was in the field of environmental law. So, I mean, that's something that certainly can and should change. The clear communication on the basis of science, and you don't have to want to have one as a pet to advocate for the protection and the value of a species.
An attendee says SeaWorld has made orcas into pets of sorts that people, including children, want to see. How do sharks achieve association with humans when we think of shark attacks in real life? I guess that's kind of what you were talking about a second ago.
Yeah. I mean, it is more of this dispassionate respect rather than cute and cuddly respect. And so I think there's different ways in which we the more we understand about ecosystems and the roles that animals play in the natural or marine environment, I think there's that understanding that there is inherent value, and it doesn't have to be on your list of 10 favorite because they're cute or dynamic in the animal kingdom. Ultimately, it is about respecting them for what they offer and their role in an interconnected web. And I think that it's also related to a lot of misinformation about animal intelligence. I mean, that's something that I've had to undo as someone who's in the animal law field. I mean, when I was teaching animal law, I had a lot of this idle childlike curiosity that I wanted to resolve for myself. And I remember the first time I typed in top 25 most intelligent animals, and I was just blown away that pigs and rats and the octopus were on this list. And I thought it was going to be, the traditional favorites, the beyond the chimpanzee, but the dog and cat and other animals that we associate with higher intelligence were nowhere near the things that we just completely disregard and throw into our food system or our animal testing system.
Do you have a sense, Randy, of how people became interested in eating shark fin soup? I mean, it's who started this?
Yeah, it certainly has its roots in China and other countries in Asia and Southeast Asia, and it's really just associated with two things: business banquet occasions, very formal, celebratory, high-end meetings, and weddings and family gatherings where you want to. Also, when I was in China, it's comparable to oh, you're a guest from outside the country. We want to take you to the best Peking duck restaurant, because that's how we show that we're delivering the very best to you as our guest. Well, shark fin soup had that, and has still, unfortunately, that reputation that it's a cultural signal of excellence, whether it's in the business or a cultural setting.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much, Randy. We appreciate your being here so much, and I hope to see you in life soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.
Moving to our next speaker, Kathy Hessler. She is the inaugural Assistant Dean for Animal Education at the George Washington University Law School and Director of the Animal Legal Education Initiative. Dean Hessler has founded the Council on Animal Legal Education and the Aquatic Animal Law Project, and she co-founded and co-directs the Animal Law and Science Project with our earlier speaker, Dr. Lori Marino. So please join me in welcoming Kathy Hessler. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Get my slides up. So thank you. I've been enjoying all of the presentations, and some of what I'll talk about will pick up and echo some of the themes folks have already mentioned. So I'm going to focus on an overview of aquatic animals, because as we were just discussing at the end of Randy's presentation, we don't really know or understand these animals, and that's problematic. And then focusing on the intersection between law and science. So we begin with the understanding, or the contested notion, that animals are property. And so this, of course, includes aquatic animals. And this underpins all of the conversations that we've already been having. What we can do with these animals, what we should do with these animals, sort of starts and often stops with this concept that animals are property. So these animals are deemed either owned by private individuals, corporations, governments, or they're managed, usually by government entities. And this ownership does not require responsible care. In fact, owners can do really horrible things to these animals because they own them. They're not required to protect them from harm and can inflict harm upon them. It's problematic that animals are not seen as self-owning, especially when we're talking about animals in the wild. We have this concept problematically for some other categories of humans, and so we can learn from how we deal with that situation. But primarily, animals, especially in the wild, especially aquatic animals, are seen as a resource, and a plentiful one at that, who are designed for our use, right? Whether that's food or research or something else. And that their only utility to us is for our own ends, whether that's, again, food or something else, or just the enjoyment we enjoy while watching. So they don't matter unless they matter to us. These are problematic constructs that we have to address. Because animals are not seen as valuable for themselves, we end up having some of these deleterious effects in the law. And the law itself doesn't really know how to attribute value to animals without looking at human benefits. It's not a construct that we have developed in especially Western legal structure. This is also true for human lives in the natural world. The law doesn't really know what to do with these things and how to value them. We've been talking about public morality, and there are different constructs and different approaches, but this is a problematic area when we put it into the law. But what we do know is that when there is not value attached to an entity, to a being, it's really difficult to attach protection, right? And so this approach leads to abuse and neglect and cruelty and extinction. So we need to see these animals. How do we help people see and understand these animals? First, we need to see who they actually are. And as I have been teaching aquatic animal law and talking with students and others, one of the things that I had to share is that I didn't even know when I began this work the breadth of the kingdom, if you will, of animals in the aquatic environment. So I knew most of the animals, many of you knew and know, but I didn't know that, literally, I didn't know that corals were animals. I thought they were, these sort of rock formations upon which animals fed and that sort of thing. I didn't know sponges were animals. I didn't know sea cucumbers were animals. I didn't think of aquatic birds. I didn't think of aquatic insects and spiders. So this list is provided because if we don't know who these animals are, we can't have a reasonable conversation about how to protect them, about what uses are appropriate, that sort of thing. And so that's what we really need to start with, right? Who are these animals? And then we need to understand their biology, their capacities, and their welfare needs. Sometimes we treat all of these animals exactly the same. They're just an aquatic animal and they're on a list somehow, when their biologies are really different. The law is not bound by biological realities, right? So animals fit into a use category rather than a biological reality category. We also don't know every aquatic animal, right? So I've seen all kinds of different estimates, but some, I think reliable ones say that there's probably more than 2 million marine species, and that's just marine, not freshwater species. And just recently, with people doing deep sea mining and preparing for that really treacherous work, they said over 5,000 new species have been discovered just in a Pacific area of the deep sea. So this is just to give you a sense of the scope, if you will, of the animals. And these are some slides just to show you the variety of animals we're talking about. And so they're very different, have very different structures, have very different lives, and different needs. So use, as I mentioned, is the category that we define animals by. And that's not just aquatic animals, but it certainly is aquatic animals. So what protections they're entitled to, how we're allowed to use them, depends upon what use structure they fall into. So if they're being used as companions or for food or for fiber or for entertainment, the rules are different, the legal rules governing their use and their protection. So these are the categories that we find aquatic animals in, which is the same as we find terrestrial animals in. But some people are sometimes a little surprised that aquatic animals are, again, really, really broadly used throughout our societies. And so we can talk about these more later if folks have questions. So why are we focusing on aquatic animals? Why do they matter? Well, certainly they matter for themselves. They have autonomy and agency, and just like we matter for ourselves, they matter for themselves. They also matter for species survival, for the environment, and for us. If they're not well and healthy, it's going to have negative consequences for human beings and plants. So it's important to see and understand these animals. And how do we sort of deal with the need to do that? One of the things we have to recognize is that invisibility is a problem. These animals, more problematically than terrestrial animals, we literally can't see them, right? Most of these animals just don't know who they are, what they are, where they are. And this lack of interaction equals a lack of understanding, a lack of empathy. It's really hard, going back to the shark conversation, if we don't see them, we don't understand them, we don't really know who they are, to have empathy for them, to have an appreciation for them. Another problem that aquatic animals face, sometimes more problematically than terrestrial animals, is that we think that they exist in uncountable numbers and they're this unlimited resource, right? So we don't have to worry about how many we kill. So when we see that we kill 100 million sharks commercially, just commercially, every year, people think they can continue to do that, and there's a replenishment of that resource, which is not how it actually works. And it means we discount the value of individuals. So we look at these animals as species, as how they fit into the ecosystems when we do look at them, but we tend not to think about their individual needs, which means we need legal protections, right, and regulation against use and abuse. The good news is that there are alternatives to almost all of the uses that we have for aquatic animals, and those alternatives are growing. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So the science ends up being really important to people who are legal advocates or lay advocates. We need to understand these animals in order to know what their capacities are, in order to know how to protect them from harm. This is a list of capacities that have been scientifically proven to exist for aquatic animals. And this is not to say that every species exhibits or has been proven to exist all of these capacities, but that I'm putting these up just to share with you that animals who, again, we don't think of as having these kinds of capacities actually do have them, right? So sort of, if you think about the Dory, right, or the Finding Nemo sort of conceptualizations of goldfish and other kinds of fishes, they're not really smart, they don't have memories, right? And these things turn out not to be true. So a lot of what we actually think we know about animals, just like the sharks, turn out not to be true, and we have to undo that knowledge and actually learn accurate information so that we can understand these animals and figure out how to work with them. So sentience ends up being one of these important legal markers that people have been using to determine whether and how much animals deserve protection. The 4 animals that you see on the screen are all species who have been able to pass what's called the mirror self-recognition test. And that's a test that human children begin to be able to pass when they're about 2 years old. And that is that they can see themselves in a mirror and they recognize that that's not another being, but it's actually them. They understand then that they're an individual different than other individuals and sort of acting on the world. And that's actually a very, very high level of cognitive capacity that, again, most people didn't think animals had, and certainly not aquatic animals. So we need to understand the science, right? We need to develop a scientific literacy. We need to spend time thinking about it as advocates, and be aware of the emerging science, because this is evolving sort of all the time. There's the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, which mostly focuses on terrestrial animals, but does include cephalopods. There is a scientific consensus that fishes feel pain, although some people still contest that. There is a lot of data on sentience and on self-awareness. So we need to see first aquatic animals as animals, and then we need to figure out what their capacities are. And so this scientific literacy is something that we're working on at GW, at the Animal Law and Science Project, along with Dr. Lori Marino at Kimmela Center. This is a slide I just enjoy sharing because lawyers and scientists sometimes get into conflict, and we have different ways of thinking about risk and about evidence and uncertainty. And so this just says, if you don't make mistakes in science, you're doing it wrong. You actually should make mistakes, and if you don't correct those mistakes, you're doing it really wrong. And if you can't admit when you're mistaken, you're not really doing science at all. So how do we put law and science together? Sentience, we think, should result in legal protections. It isn't the only thing that should result in legal protections, but when we have scientific proof that animals are sentient, that means they have the capacity to suffer. And so we should make sure we're not causing unnecessary harm and suffering. We have to decide what is unnecessary. We have to decide what is harm and suffering. Those are big conversations to have, but we should be having those conversations. We should also impose upon ourselves a duty to use and to develop alternatives to the use of these animals, because we know using them causes them harm and suffering. And so I suggest that we shift our defaults, that we use the precautionary principle, and that means basically if we think that harm is going to occur, we try and think of doing something else, right? Before we start a new system or start a new use that's going to cause harm. I also think at this point we have enough data on sentience across the animal kingdom, if you will, that we should assume that all beings have sentience. They all have some developed capacity to feel harm so that they can avoid harm, right? It just makes biological sense. And so I think we should shift the burden to others to prove that animals don't have sentience. And that way we'd have a baseline of treating them more appropriately. So there has been some legal impact from this new science around, or the developing science around sentience, and some challenges to this. Obviously, sentience itself is a human framework, a human construct, and it continues to prioritize, right, this human primacy, if you will, that animals are only valuable or can only be protected when they have something that is like what we have, right? So if they feel pain like we have, or they have cognition like we have, then we're like, oh, well, maybe they're enough like us that they deserve protection. So that's a problematic construct. Having said that, at least when they do have those structures and we know it, it means there should be some legal consequences to that determination. And that is happening. So we see in the UK, in their sentience declaration, that included, it didn't initially, but it does now include all decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks, which is really good because the science was sufficient to show that they actually have sentience. So Spain has some recognition for animal sentience in their criminal code and now through civil legislation as well. Germany recognizes sentience. There's a case in Alberta. There's, as Randy mentioned, the Port Townsend Proclamation. So this is beginning to advance, if you will, and this is even outside of the rights of nature conversation. So there are some jurisdictions that recognize sentience, and there's some additional impacts that we can talk about later, but I won't go into just now. I want to mention two of the legal regulatory approaches that we already have for terrestrial animals, but we don't typically apply to aquatic animals. So one is something called the 3 R's in research, which is reducing their use, limiting their pain, and replacing them where possible. But the law that we have, the Animal Welfare Act, to regulate the use of animals in research doesn't apply, generally speaking, to aquatic animals, except marine mammals, getting back to that cute and cuddly kind of image of the animals we want to protect. And in agriculture, we have this concept that comes from Europe, is not really well used in the US, called the 5 freedoms, right? When we've decided to raise animals for our own use, we should give them at least some basic freedoms from hunger, thirst, discomfort, pain, fear, and distress, and the ability to express normal behaviors. That last one, we're beginning to see some legislation, state by state, some local jurisdictions. So we're making some progress on this, but again, nothing is applied to aquatic animals in this context right now. So this, the pictures on the right are the OPA fish. I don't know about you all, but when I was in school, I was taught that fishes were cold-blooded animals. And we now have evidence that there are some partially warm-blooded fish. And just in 2015, this tells you how much science we still need, the first truly warm-blooded fish, the OPA, was discovered. Why is this relevant? Because the Animal Welfare Act excludes fishes but protects warm-blooded animals. And now we have this conflict, right? So we have a warm-blooded fish. So what should the AWA do? My solution is protect them, but that's not necessarily how it will go. So I want to run through really quickly some uses. This is the kind of image we often have for fishing, right? So the killing of fishes for food. This is, in fact, more the reality. It's just industrial scale, taking trillions and trillions of these animals out of the ocean and freshwater environments every year. And we're doing it now in a farmed way, both outside and inside, right, in these factory-like facilities. So the amount that we're doing this is really overwhelming. So 178 million tons of animals, and that's our 2020 data, and that's both aquaculture and capture, the wild caught fishing. And this is increasing, right, year over year, and the numbers again are pretty astounding. So just in one country, Norway, and just one species, salmon, and one style of capture, farming, 54 million farm salmon per year in Norway alone, right? It's mind-boggling. And so the numbers are astounding, both for the animals themselves, for the environmental consequences. And why we're doing this, it's not just for food, for human beings. We're breeding and we're capturing these animals for all kinds of other uses, for hatcheries, for bait fish, some for research, some farming for teeth and skins, for fish meal, fish oil, bait, pet food, animal feed, drugs. And this sector is very, very lucrative and it's increasing. And it's very wasteful, right? So 35% of the global harvest is lost or wasted. And that's astounding when we're thinking about all of these lives, right? And as was discussed before, we're at really challenging levels of how much fishing we're doing in our oceans. And the prediction is that by 2027, which is not that far, we're going to be 100% maximally fished, which is challenging. These are just some other uses, again, that people don't often think about. So alligator farming, crocodile farming, the amount of pearls, think about how many pearls it takes to get to 700 tons. All these different animals, right? And the zebrafish being farmed for research, dolphins being used by Navy, people wanting to farm octopus. Again, we can talk about that more later. The legislation, I'm not going to go into very deeply. The sort of important point here is that most of the laws that we have in the United States to protect or that address the protection of animals exclude aquatic animals. So the AWA, the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act, etc. These all exclude aquatic animals, right? And at the state level, anti-cruelty laws, generally speaking, also exclude aquatic animals, or if they're included, they may be exempted under the traditional exemptions for farming, research, hunting, fishing, right? And right now, aquaculture is just not widely regulated. There are some other legal perspectives that we can consider. Tribal and indigenous perspectives are really important here, both because of their historical relationship with aquatic animals and also their desire to protect the ecosystem and what we can learn from them. There's also obviously lots of international legal perspectives to take into account that we can, again, talk about. So the law is evolving. That's the good news. As Randy sort of mentioned, there are different ways of thinking about it. And so this is just a list of some of those ways. So property, property plus, animal rights, rights of nature, rights holders, Pachamama, ecofeminism, deep ecology, and tribal rights. These are different legal frameworks that may lead us to different places when we think about how to deal with the animals. I just want to highlight a couple of constructs that people just want to keep an eye on. So octopus farming, both in Hawaii, which was enjoined, and there's an effort in the Canary Islands. There's an effort to try and put a bill to ban octopus farming. So this is an effort that people are trying to make happen, and people are trying to push back. The vaquita, most people may know how endangered they are, and unfortunately, we didn't decide to do very much about that in the U.S. Corals, incredibly endangered. Climate change is making it worse. There's some AI options to help. We have the UN Treaty on Marine Biodiversity now, and countries are signing at a pretty rapid pace, so that's very good. I mentioned the UK Sentience Bill, and this is just a list of some of the most endangered aquatic animals, so you have a sense of who they are. So reframing and thinking about the laws, we need to stop seeing animals in the natural world primarily as a resource, right, for human use, and thinking about all of the exploitative and extractive uses of the natural and built environment, and that they compound on each other, so not just fishing and aquaculture, thinking about sustainability and thinking about the animals for themselves. And when we don't do that, it hurts the environment, it impoverishes the development of the law, hinders creation of appropriate mechanisms to restrain the cruelty and abuse that humans inflict on animals all the time. And it constrains a broad understanding, conceptualization, and implementation of the animal protection measures that we actually do have. Right? It deprioritizes that enforcement. So animals actually are not they are not property, even if legally they are, they really shouldn't be that way. They are not products, and they are not ours. So we need to improve how we think about their interest in our decision making, right? Thinking about accepting the science, accepting our legal obligations to do no unnecessary harm to them, and thinking sometimes about reminding ourselves that humans are animals as well, and that we're not the only ones that require consideration. So we need to reframe these relationships and look for mutually supportive ways to coexist. So I think I'll skip that in the interest of time and just mention that these are two of the projects we're doing at GW. So the Animal Law and Science Project, which you mentioned, and the Aquatic Animal Law Project. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for that insightful presentation. There is a question coming in from an attendee. Jenna, who is an aquatic vet, says some vets like me still hang on to the idea of fish don't feel pain. although the science is clear, it's difficult to navigate. It's not really a question, more of a comment. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it takes a lot more energy to uneducate about misinformation than it does to educate people from scratch, right? So when people just literally don't know something, it's a lot easier to say, hey, here's some information, and you can take this into account in your decision making. But when people believe and feel that they know something already, whether that's that sharks are predators, or whether it's fish don't feel pain, or whether it's goldfishes are stupid, right? Whatever it is that they think they know, it takes an awful lot of energy, both mental energy and sort of that emotional energy that I think Lori was talking about, right? Because you have to sort of admit you're wrong, and nobody likes doing that, right? And then you try and you know you're not the only one who feels that way. And so it's kind of, hard to let go of this stuff. And you're getting some of these messages continually reinforced, whether that's through the legal system or through movies, right? Whatever, right? So it's like, well, these people are telling me fish aren't stupid and they can feel. But these people still think that, that's not true. That's what I thought. I'm kind of in this camp. And so I'm not dumb. I'm not wrong. I'm not stupid.
Right.
Well, you're not. You've just been told incorrect information. And so that takes an awful lot more work to undo and then share the new information. So this is why we have this Law and Science project, right? Because we really need the scientists to come in and say to folks in the legal and the regulatory field, here's the actual reality. And so it's nice to be able to have some experts we can say, well, you don't have to believe me, right? Believe these folks. And so when someone with a science degree can come in and say that, it's helpful. So that helps us get over this challenge. But as the comment suggests, it's difficult. It takes time. It takes lots of repetition. We need to get these messages out in not just like social media, but in the movies, right? And on TV and in the news, so that that repetition will really help the re-education process.
The person who asked that question, Jenna, says, thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Thanks for the question and comment.
Other questions from attendees? Let's see here. Actually, I have a question, which is, we can't even take care of people. So we have homelessness, drug addiction, we have migrants coming into the country that we're not able necessarily to care for properly, and inner cities with their issues and so on. So how do we find the bandwidth to include animals in all of this?
It's a good question. So I hear people have been saying to me through all my life, why are you doing this when there are these other important problems? Like, well, first of all, I can multitask. I can support, helping end homelessness while I'm also working to help protect animals. And there are people who are working on, there are more people working on homelessness, if you will, just to pick, or houselessness, an issue, than there are working on this issue. So we're not suggesting that everybody has to do everything. So if this is not something people feel bandwidth for, that's fine. There are other people who are doing the work. But one of the things we can all do is stop creating harm, right? We can stop shopping for exotic fish in pet stores. We can stop eating them. We can stop, as a culture, breeding them for entertainment, whether that's in theme parks or use in Hollywood movies. We can stop breeding them for research. This is one of those areas where it really is a great example of how helping the animals helps humans. So 85 to 95% of the research that's conducted on animals, right? You have to go through 2 species before you get to human clinical trials. 85 to 95% of that fails, right? Fails when it gets to human clinical trials, because animals aren't great models, right? We know that even men aren't good models for women, right? We know that this is not good science. So we're wasting tons of time, tons of money, right? When we should be doing better science. So if we use alternatives that we already have and develop even more alternatives to the use of animals in research, we will be at the same time helping the animals and helping people. So I think there's a number of ways in which we can look at those synergies, right? There's the sort of just one health concept, that helping animals, helping people, helping the planet. those are the solutions we should be looking for. So this shouldn't be animals versus humans, right? We're animals, and it shouldn't be non-human animals and human animals. It should be, let's find solutions that are better for our world, for all of us.
So what do you think about, there was that incident in Maine recently regarding that shooter that killed a lot of people at a bowling alley and so on, and they found the perpetrator deceased. And I noted at the press conference that the spokesman for the state was saying, well, now we can start the hunting season. So the good part is now we have found the perpetrator. There's no maniac running around with a gun. We can all get our own guns and go out and hunt. And what about the idea that some of what we do, like hunting of deer or harvesting aquatic life, prevents overpopulation? So we're actually doing something.
Generally speaking, how it works. Again, it's misinformation that we've been fed. So deer hunting in particular, and I have engaged in protesting of deer hunting, and so I did a lot of research on this. And I'm in the DC area, which is where I did it, and so they would have them in preserves, like wildlife preserves, which is crazy, first of all. And they would let people plant seed corn, right, that nobody would harvest, so that the deer population would increase, so they could sell more permits, so people could hunt. So deer are a really interesting case study, if you will, because they have what's called a carrying capacity. And so they won't reproduce beyond their carrying capacity. So a female deer has the ability to actually reabsorb fetal tissue into her body if there's not enough food to go around for more mouths, right? So deer are really, really interesting, but we have completely changed their habitat. Right. And we end up planting things that they like to eat, whether that's, in our backyards or on our farms or what have you, or intentionally. And then we say, oh gosh, there's too many deer. If we really thought there were too many deer, we wouldn't let people hunt the bucks with the big antlers. We would let them hunt the doe, right? The females, because that's what's going to affect the carrying capacity. But we have this honestly testosterone driven conceptualization right behind hunting that has nothing to do with the scientific management, if you will, of these populations. So no, hunting is not helping manage the populations, and fishing is not necessary to manage the populations. These animals are fine without us, before us, aside from us. And if we just stopped, like if we just stopped fishing the ocean, in 10 years, they could rebound to closer to more normal. And this is the only environmental/animal problem that we have, that we could fix that quickly if we just stopped, right? The oceans would repair themselves. So it's not really ever for the benefit of those animal populations. It's always a human excuse.
Mm-hmm. I have a question from an attendee, Ken. Are antibiotics and other medications in the aquaculture industry accounted for in the food chain?
Not particularly well, right? So they don't even necessarily need to report this, and especially because the laws are going to be really different in different jurisdictions for different countries. So this is the problem with the lack of regulation of the aquaculture industry right now, and that industry is just growing and growing. So, and it's not even just antibiotics being used for the animals while they're in captivity. There are things like delicing, agents, and agents that are spread on the pens, the net pens, to stop them from either rusting or some. So there's all kinds of chemicals, and then there's the fecal waste, and there's and the pharmaceuticals that are again prophylactically treating them, because we know when we put them in these confined conditions, there's a lot of disease. So yeah, that stuff is not particularly well cataloged, if you will, and it's certainly not shared with the consumers, and it's not regulated in the ways that it should be.
I think we're out of time. Thank you again, Kathy, so much here. And I think we'll move on to Patrick is our next speaker. Hello, Patrick. Patrick is a marine biologist, originally from Santa Rosa, Northern California. to the University of Hawaii. Oops, my cat just bumped my script here. For undergraduate degree, where he studied false killer whales and juvenile scalloped hammerheads. He now works as a field research technician at the State University Long Beach Shark Lab, where he also received his master's degree in biology with an emphasis in marine biology. Thank you for being here, Patrick.
Perfect. Well, let me share my screen here and we can get started. All right, perfect. Cool. Well, I first want to say thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I know there's a lot of hype for Shark Week, but it really has been the shark decade for white sharks because they've seen quite a decrease in their populations and subsequent increase. And then right now what we're looking at is the impacts of that increase of an apex predator. So I'm going to go over a little bit about the history of that decrease and increase, and then a little bit of what we do at the Shark Lab and how we study these animals, and then a little bit about what I did in studying those impacts. So there have been historically some fisheries for white sharks. So in California, specifically the nearshore set gillnet, this fishery caught juveniles specifically, although there was some limited targeting of adults off the farallons, not just for meat, but also for trophies. So those big jaws people love to display. And then there was also some higher commercial bycatch, and bycatch is not catching what you want, but catching something else in nearshore gillnet fisheries in Mexico waters. So those are a little bit less regulated, and they would be caught as bycatch. So because of this, because we were catching the adults and the juveniles, again, this is an apex predator. So any removal of even a small amount of that population could do drastic damage to the population. There was state and federal protection in place in the 1990s and 2005 because of the small sharks were landed and sold in fish markets and restaurants. So if you ate fish tacos in the late 1980s, you probably, anything that had like flake probably had some white shark in it. So you might have eaten white shark in your past. But predominantly the biggest impact on this population, and this paper was published in 2012 by Dr. Chris Lowe, was from this nearshore set gillnet. And you can see historically, almost half of our records of white shark landings coming from the Department of Fish and Game gillnet logbooks. And to show you the discrepancy between the impact of this fishery versus other ones, we have this graph right here. It shows all of our gear on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the number of sharks reported, and then the size class in colors of various sizes. So we can see the entanglement, or that set drift net, is pulling quite a number of sharks out of the population, where there's really minimal interaction with any of these other gears with the white shark population. To show you again how drastic this impact on the population was, we have a similar graph. We've got our time series on the x-axis, the y-axis, the number of white sharks removed or landed, and then the number of sets in that fishery on the opposite y-axis. So we can see that there are a number of sharks that are interacting with the fishery. However, after our nearshore set gillnet ban in 1994 and the California protection of white sharks, we see a drastic decrease in that number of sets that are put out every single year. However, after about 10 years, like Dean Hessler was talking about, we started to see an explosion of interactions of young of the year white sharks in this fishery. So it's not necessarily that they're fishing more, we know that they're fishing less, we're just seeing more sharks being caught. So we do think that specifically this ban was actually really great for the population and allowed for kind of repopulation of the California coastline. However, just protecting the juveniles wasn't necessarily the only thing that we did. So there was also the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, as well as the Clean Water Act of the same year, the recertification of the Magnuson-Stevens Act in 1996, and the Marine Life Protection Act in 1999. So we can see there's an explosion of the populations of things like northern elephant seals, sea otters, harbor seals over the last 50 years, and those are the preferred adult white shark prey items. So we also were, again, with the Clean Water Act, protecting their environment. So surprise, surprise, you protect the juveniles of a population, you protect their food source, and you protect their environment. And we start to see an increase in the population. And this little infographic shows what we're talking about. So we see a pretty steady decline in their populations. And this is specifically the northeastern Pacific population of white sharks. We have all of our acts on the x-axis and some indications of just general population levels over time for white sharks, sea lions, and stingrays. And as you can see, with all those protections in place, over the last 20 years, we really have seen an increase in the white shark population that uses the California coastline. So while us shark scientists might say, yes, that's a great conservation success story, not everyone thinks that. So there's been an increase of a five-fold increase in sharks spotted in Southern California over the last 10 years. And these are heavily populated areas. So around 20 million people are visiting these beaches year-round, doing things like surfing, swimming, stand-up paddleboarding, bodyboarding, and wading, which may put them in the realm of interacting with these animals. So there's also been an increase in temporary beach closures due to shark sightings. So instead of potentially allowing for some harmful interactions between sharks and people, they just close the beach. However, there has not been any significant increase in bites on people. So those beach closures actually do a lot of economic damage to the surrounding coastal towns. And there's also been a lot of negative media about the shark presence along these beaches. So even though there's not any bites happening, there is significant economic decreases in the surrounding areas because of fear in the general populace. So the other problem is that, if you're a lifeguard, you have sharks on your beach, and they don't really know how to react to that. And that's one of the things that we here in the Shark Lab are trying to do, is provide them the best available science to allow them to make the best available decisions to not only keep people safe, but also to reduce some of those negative impacts of sharks just being in their natural habitat. So getting into a little bit about white shark ecology, or where they hang out. So adult white sharks are typically only found in offshore islands like Santa Cruz, Catalina, or in the central coastline around San Francisco or Morro Bay, Monterey. And those generally align with feeding aggregation sites. Those elephant seal rookeries, those are their favorite prey items. Whereas the juveniles are really only in Southern California in spring through fall. So the Southern California bites is actually a natural nursery habitat for them. And there's a couple different reasons for that. Provides safety from those large pelagic predators. It also has a really large food source. So if you've ever been in the water in Southern California, you know there's tons of stingrays, which is the juvenile's favorite prey. And those shallow waters also create a warm habitat for them to grow extremely efficiently. So because of this, we start to see juvenile white shark aggregations, or groups of large amount of animals in a very small area. So these are present throughout the year, again, mainly in that summertime, and they may move between different beaches. So they'll generally select one specific beach area, stay there for a couple of weeks to a couple of months, and then migrate to another one throughout the year. Now, again, this may be explained by a combination of several factors. So it may be all those animals are exploiting the same resources, safety, warmth, and food, but there may also be a social aspect. So these animals are noticing that there's other sharks in the area and their safety in numbers for this really vulnerable life history class. So they form these loose aggregations where we can have anywhere between 5 to 50 animals in a really 2-mile stretch of beach, so a very small area. So this does allow us to create a unique study opportunity for us, because these are highly mobile migratory species. So we have all these animals in one area that we can study for long periods of time. And a few pieces of the technology that we use to study these animals are spot tags, pat tags, acoustic tags, and smart tags. So spot tags are smart position and temperature tags. And these are bolted into the animal's dorsal fin. And anytime that dorsal fin breaks the surface, it's like dropping a pin right where that shark is, and then transmits to a satellite, and then we get that data. However, they do have to be permanently bolted into the animal. They do a lot of damage. So we've really drifted away from this technology, even though it is very useful. We use PAT tags, or pop-up archival tags. So these log date, time, temperature, depth, as well as light level. And with that, it's not like dropping a pin. It would be like saying, okay, the shark is somewhere in a 60-mile radius along that beach. So it's a much broader, coarser location, but it does allow us to study them for long periods of time, say 6 months to a year. And then after that year, it's got a pre-programmed pop-up date. So it'll pop off the animal up to the surface and then transmit all that data to us. We then download it and can study their locations. And then we also use acoustic telemetry. So we put in acoustic tags that emit an ultrasonic ping that are then heard by receivers that you can see right over here that are permanently moored along the coastline. And anytime a receiver hears an acoustic tag, it will log a date, time, and then ID for that animal. So we know that anytime that is detected, we know the shark is somewhere in the radius, the hearing radius of that receiver. And lastly, we have smart tags. So these, we developed them ourselves. We call them kind of the shark Fitbit. They clamp onto the shark's dorsal fin, log depth, temperature, movement in 6 axes, as well as velocity of their movement. And then we track their locations for about 24 hours, where it'll pop up and then we'll download that data. So predominantly what we do use are acoustic telemetry. And here is all the locations of about 165 receivers that we have in Southern California. So these are present year-round, so this is how we can track them for long periods of time. And since 2010, we've been tracking over 500 animals, and we've determined that they form these nursery hotspots. So these nursery hotspots are ephemeral. They do change every couple of years. You can see in 2010 through 2012, it was in the northern Santa Monica Bay, and this has shifted through that time period up till now. And currently those hotspots are Carpinteria and Del Mar Torrey Pines. So they're here generally through the summertime, and then when our waters get too cold, they migrate down. Now, what we can notice from this map is that almost all of these locations are right along the coast. Is this going to increase the number of bites that we see in Southern California, which is where some of my research comes into play? So what kind of effects does just simply having a nearshore shark presence have? So California has about a $17.6 billion ocean economy, and that was estimated in 2015, so it's likely exponentially more than that now. So simply shark presence, not just white sharks, can have a beach effect on beach use. So some obvious beach safety concerns of bites, but when bites do happen, they do depress beach use for 3 months after the effects, which does have economic impacts. And even when bites don't happen, simply just having a high shark presence can reduce surfing by 28%. So this creates a socioeconomic and beach safety issue for California. And although bites are rare, they're not the majority of human-shark interactions, they do drive shark policy. So things like shark exclusionary barriers have high bycatch rates. They're about $38 million every single year, and they don't necessarily decrease the bite rate that is observed in places like Australia. So they don't really work, and they're extremely expensive for something that happens extremely rarely. So the other question is, why do we care about juvenile white sharks in California? Because these are the babies, right? So the northeastern Pacific population of white sharks account for 97% of all unprovoked bites in California, and that's the population that uses the California coastline. So large juveniles or small subadults are thought to be involved in a high frequency of these bites. This is where they transition from that stingray diet to marine mammals. So we do think that these are naive hunters that are learning how to hunt, and they simply make a mistake and unfortunately grab a person instead of a seal or sea lion. And again, these juveniles form large aggregations in Southern California and Central California. So they are mixed size classes, so 1.2 meters at birth, which is about 4.5 feet, to 3 meters or 10 feet when they start to become that subadult size range. So with that increasing shark population and an increasing human population, we need to do a risk assessment to see if bites may increase over the next few years. However, to do this, we needed to both understand how humans and sharks use the nearshore area. And we generally know how people use beaches. So on the in the summertime, on the weekends, during holidays, we know beach use will increase, but we really don't know what people are doing. Are they surfing, bodyboarding, stand-up paddleboarding? How far offshore are they going? So this creates a really large gap in knowledge when we're trying to assess how often they're coming into close proximity to sharks. Now, we also need to understand how juvenile white sharks use this area. So what we know so far is that they show philopatry and high site-specific residency in Southern California. So like I said, they'll come back to Southern California every year, migrate to Mexico, and migrate back the next summer, and they'll be in those hot spots for a couple weeks to a couple months at a time. It's really prolonged time in one area. And they primarily use waters that are 10 meters or 30 feet or shallower. And they exhibit what you can see here, which is patrolling behavior. So what that is a really long, straight swim parallel to shore until they reach the end of the beach, and then they'll basically just turn around. So we know that they're potentially coming into contact with people or close proximity to people multiple times a day. However, most of these studies are presence-absence data from acoustic telemetry. So again, that just lets us know that that shark is present in that area. It doesn't tell us anywhere how close to shore that shark is coming or how far off shore that's going, or the shark is. So this creates a gap in knowledge, another gap in knowledge about how close juvenile white sharks get to people and how they interact with people. So without assessing both of these things and how often sharks are in close proximity to people, we simply can't do this risk assessment. So my research objectives for my project were to quantify human juvenile white shark distribution overlap at multiple spatial scales across Southern California, assess how environmental variables may affect this overlap, like wave height or tidal range, and quantify which group of water users have more overlap with juvenile white sharks and where encounters may occur. So the ultimate goal of this project was to be able to predict when various user groups have a higher likelihood of encountering juvenile white sharks and identify methods that can be easily reproduced around anywhere that has a coastline. So for just the time, I'm going to focus just on objective 1 and objective 3. If you have any questions about objective 2, you can ask me or email me after the talk. So for my project, I flew aerial surveys that look like this along Southern California from Point Conception to San Diego. And in frame, I had the shoreline, the wave break, and all available subjects. And then for humans, I count and categorize them to waders, swimmers, bodyboarders, surfers, and stand-up paddleboarders. From this, I can then measure from the individual to the shoreline and from the individual to the wave break here as well. So I flew about 1 kilometer or 3/4 of a mile down the coastline and then basically mowed the lawn out to about 500 meters offshore or 1/4 mile offshore. I could then do the same thing with sharks when they, sorry, this is a little granulated, but when sharks were in the same frame as well, I could do the same process. So the drones also have a high resolution metadata, so date, time, and GPS that can then pair with publicly available databases to collect all of that environmental variables to study when and where there's a higher shark and human presence in Southern California. So this study did focus in Southern California because of the ease of collecting data for both people and juvenile white sharks. We've got a population of both of those here. But this data collection process is also easily reproducible by any licensed drone pilot. So that's already one checkbox for us. Anyone with a license can do this anywhere around the world. So just to define some spatial distributions that I'll be talking about. So coast-wide distributions of every beach that I surveyed along my study. There are some black spots that I couldn't survey because of airports or military bases. The beach-specific distributions, so this is actually spatial use of specific beaches where juvenile white sharks aggregate, and then, and then the nearshore distribution. So this is human shark distributions within 500 meters of shore. So getting into some results, this inset is just another look at what my surveys look like. But I flew 1,644 surveys over 163 survey days. These surveys were conducted monthly at each location, and I included overall about 26 different beach locations in my study. This study spanned from January 2019 through March of 2021, and I collected over 700 hours of footage of honestly mostly water, but people and sharks. And this is just some quick results. This is a map of all my study locations, as well as where I observed sharks along my study. So these blue diamonds are where I surveyed and never saw any sharks. These colored and graduated symbols are where I saw sharks of small individuals or low numbers of individuals. And these red stars are where I observed aggregations. And I'll define that in the next slide. And just real quick, while we have the map up, we can go over where I saw humans. So waders and surfers, I saw them everywhere, almost every time I surveyed. Surfing super popular, wading super popular. So every single beach had people there all the time doing those two things. Swimmers and bodyboarders were common everywhere, but pretty much only during the summertime. And then stand-up paddleboarders were extremely rare, although one beach in Ventura was extremely popular for whatever reason. And getting into some shark results, the shark coastwide distribution are in the south, and to show you how pleasant that was, with 1,204 observations of sharks, 752 of those were at Carpinteria, and 344 of those were at Del Mar. So the number of sharks that were observed per survey day ranged from 1 to 90, although this does include repeat observations of the same individuals. So if a shark was kind of swimming in and out, I would observe them twice because I couldn't tell if it was the same shark or not. So I did observe 2 aggregations. So that was defined as 5 individuals observed at one beach. And they weren't observed until August of 2019, although I did observe 4 sharks in Solana throughout the summer of 2019. Now that is important because although I saw 4 sharks in the summer of 2019 in Solana Beach, I never saw them ever again after that summer. So these aggregations are extremely spatially specific because Solana and Del Mar are actually adjacent beaches, they're touching. So I didn't see, even though I saw quite a large aggregation at Del Mar, I never saw them spill over into Solana Beach. So in Carpinteria, this aggregation formed in 2019 and persisted through March, the rest of the study. It's actually still present there today. And Del Mar formed in June of 2020, and it's still the same story. It's still present there today as well. So both of these beaches are very similar. So they're about 3.5 kilometers in length. And these are similarly dense aggregations. So 15 individuals were observed in one survey in Carpinteria, whereas 11 were observed in Del Mar. Again, these were not observed at neighboring beaches, so incredibly spatially specific, but there was actually evidence of overwintering. So instead of migrating down to Mexico, a couple of these sharks actually stayed in Southern California throughout the winter time. So what we're observing is that there is a shift in their migration patterns. So these animals aren't leaving. So there might be a year-long presence of juvenile white sharks in Southern California as our waters continue to warm. And getting into something that we're calling co-occurrence with this coastwide distribution, we defined this as when humans and juvenile white sharks were observed at the same beach during the same survey day. So of the 163 survey days that I conducted, 74 of these resulted in co-occurrence. And of the 60 survey days that I performed at aggregation sites, 58% of these were involved co-occurrence. So to put that in perspective, 97% of the time that someone was in the water at these aggregation sites, they were at the same beach as a juvenile white shark. To break that down further, we have a table of all of our water user groups, the rate of co-occurrence, and the average number of people that were present doing each activity here as well. So just some quick takeaways. Again, surfing and wading was very popular with some really high rates of co-occurrence and a high number of people that were present with juvenile white sharks. These bodyboarders and swimmers were lower rates, but again, they were only present during the summer. And then stand-up paddleboarders were extremely rare. Now, this high co-occurrence within aggregations indicates that encounters may be happening daily. So again, I was only surveying about once a month. So those sharks are likely doing that patrolling behavior and encountering potentially hundreds of people every single day. And again, these hotspots are ephemeral. So when these aggregations do break and they form in other places, we can conclude that there will be a high human juvenile white shark co-occurrence at those new locations, which does help these water safety departments when they're trying to decide what to do when those sharks do show up. So getting into some beach-specific distributions in our northern aggregation site of Carpinteria, what you're looking at is the 95% human and juvenile white shark kernel density estimation or area use. So basically, the warmer the color, the more area use, the colder the color, the less area use. Sharks are in these colors, whereas humans are not, just for ease of visualization. And then we all have beach access in these red triangles. So some real quick takeaways is that, surprisingly, not surprising, is that humans are very lazy. So they were only about 200 meters away from this public beach access. So that really contracted their space use at this beach. Whereas juvenile white sharks were not restricted by anything, so they were using the entire beach area. But again, this is only about maybe 2 miles long, so it's not that much space for these animals to be spending all their time in. But we can also see that the core area used by both people and sharks is overlaid almost 1-to-1. So we know that there's a lot of spatial overlap. What about overlap over time? So Carpinteria is actually not a very widely human-used beach. There's really not a lot of human presence across most of the year. However, there's an explosion of human presence in the summertime, again, which makes sense. But we can see that it doesn't really affect juvenile white sharks. So the white sharks have pretty much the same Hello? Okay. think I'm back. Regardless of whether humans were present or not. But we can see that, again, there was some decrease in presence in the wintertime. So if we look at our, oops, let me get back here. If we look at our southern aggregation site, we can see that it's pretty much the same thing. So we have our humans are much more spread out by this beach access. We can see a much more contracted area used by juvenile white sharks. Now there is a patch reef right here. So that does actually create a foraging area for the sharks and consistent surf for humans for recreation, which is again why we see an overlap of almost one-to-one core area use in Del Mar, even though it's a very different situation. And we can see that even though there is a much more heavily human-used beach at Del Mar, is actually not about the same shark use. So it didn't really matter where the sharks were, they behaved pretty much the same. So again, although there was more overlap in the fall in Del Mar. So human use is incredibly predictable. So instead of looking at where the juvenile white sharks are hanging out, these encounters may actually be happening where humans are and not the juvenile white sharks. And lastly, getting to the nearshore distribution, on the x-axis here, we've got our distance from wave break. This red indicates the wave break, and we have all of our water user groups in the y-axis here, and the number of individuals that I observed is the N here as well. So this is a box and whisker plot. So basically, the larger the lump here means the more the data is concentrated at that location along the x-axis. So the real quick takeaways is that the waders and bodyboarders really have no overlap with juvenile white sharks. Those groups that spend most of their time outside the wave break have quite a bit of overlap with juvenile white sharks. And stand-up paddlers have more overlap than any other water user group. And surprisingly, white sharks are spending about almost all of their time within 100 meters of the shoreline, which is very, very close to where people are using the water for recreation. Now, when we look at who's more likely to encounter juvenile white sharks, we can see that surfers have an order of magnitude more presence in Southern California. So even though they have less overlap, it's more likely that surfers will be present when juvenile white shark is along the beach. So this high predictability of humans across this coastwide, beach-specific, and nearshore distributions indicate that we can predict where encounters occur when aggregations form. So some just real quick takeaways and impacts. This human beach use is incredibly predictable. Juvenile white shark sites are less predictable, so they are a little bit ephemeral. We're working on that right now to figure out where they're going. But human juvenile white shark co-occurrence is high when they do form. So this high beach-specific and nearshore distribution overlap indicates encounters may occur daily within aggregations without an increase in bites. And lifeguard agencies may actually be able to use this information to increase water user safety when new aggregations form along our beach. And lastly, drones are a low-cost, easy-to-use survey tool to observe human-shark encounters. So the real big takeaway from the study was that while encounter rates may be high for those water users outside the wave break, continued protection of white sharks may not increase the likelihood of bites occurring, because we never saw any aggressive behavior of white sharks to any individual human along this study. So I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to thank all of my funding sources that helped me do this project, and I'll take any of the questions if I do have time.
Thank you so much, Patrick. This is really fascinating stuff. Do any of the attendees have questions? I think we have time for maybe one question. So let me ask you a question, Patrick. What do you think the role of the law is in protecting white sharks? Does the law have
Yeah. I do actually think that the law has really helped, protecting the species, the gillnet ban and actually protecting them has done a lot to protect the animal and increase their population. I would also argue that there need to be further regulations, because what we're actually seeing is that because people know that the sharks are there, they know that the sharks are going to be there for a long time, they've actually started to antagonize the animals. So although stand-up paddleboarders were the rarest group to observe, I actually saw that they spent the most time around the animals. So instead of the animal coming up to a surfer and kind of deciding that it didn't want to interact with the surfer and going on its way, what happens is the stand-up paddleboarders go out specifically to see the sharks, and they'll tail these animals for 30 minutes. after the shark has repeatedly what we call kind of kicking off, which is just a quick swipe of the tail to get away from a stimulus. And then the stand-up paddleboarder will find them again. And this is a problem because it's a nursery habitat. These animals are there to feed, to rest, to grow. And if you're disturbing those natural processes, you can actually limit that growth. And this is the most vulnerable life history stage of a white shark. They don't technically know they're white sharks, so they can be eaten. They're smaller than they are at 20 feet. So they are very vulnerable. So it actually prolongs that vulnerable stage. And we are starting to see people, some targeted recreational fisheries. People want to catch white sharks. They want to take the picture. And what's happening is that they're catching them, dragging them through the surf, bringing them onto the shoreline, taking their picture, and then just releasing them. And there's a couple problems with that. Again, it's really stressful for the animal. If they can't bring the shark to shore, if it's too strong, they cut the line. So that actually, now the shark's dragging, we've seen 200 feet of not even line, it's actually bike cable. So it's now steel or cable that's dragging behind the animal that can get caught. But then also you have now a threatened, scared animal that's now in the presence of surfers and other people. So it changes the dynamic of an animal just passing through, and now creates an injured or scared animal, and they may actually lash out to anything that's nearby. So I think there needs to be more regulations on these aggregation sites, but it's tough. That's enforcement is always going to be an issue. And, it's very easy for fishermen to say like, oh, I didn't mean to catch a white shark. It's like, well, you're fishing on a beach with steel leader. What else are you catching? But it's tough. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Patrick. We're going to move on now to our final speaker, Amy P. Wilson. After over a decade of practicing corporate and commercial law, Amy began focusing on animal, human, and nature rights. She's the co-founder and director of Animal Law Reform South Africa, the first dedicated animal law nonprofit in the country. She's a doctoral candidate, research associate, and lecturer at the University of Johannesburg. She teaches animal law. Please join me in welcoming Amy Wilson.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks so much for having me today at this wonderful event. It's been really interesting and I've learned a lot. So today I'm going to be talking about aquatic rights at the intersection of justice for animals, humans, and the environment. I'm going to go through a lot quite quickly. So if there is any time left over, I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can reach out to me afterwards. So the first question I wanted to look at is how our use and exploitation of aquatic life, specifically aquatic animals, impacts on animal nature and human rights and interests. And then secondly, what do these intersections then mean for those of us who are seeking to challenge this exploitation and use and achieve better protection for them, or justice is specifically the lens I'm looking through. I refer to inclusive justice. So I'm first going to go through some foundations and focus areas, and the three lenses through which I'm going to look are those animals, environmental and human interests, and then just give a couple of examples what it might look like going ahead following an integrational type approach. So getting into some of the foundations, I first want to look at this idea of rights and legal rights in particular. So I'm going to zoom us way back out to look at our beautiful blue planet, since we are talking about aquatic life, right? Earth is about 4.54 billion years old, with a massive surface area of both land, but predominantly water, which is very relevant for our discussion today. And also just to consider that we live among various other species, fungal species, plant species, and various other animal species, right, including human animals. And those numbers are just estimates because we have absolutely no idea of the exact number and figures. But who is rights holders? Well, out of those millions of species, only one of us holds legal rights, okay? And that's us, the Homo sapiens, modern day human animals, as we've been around for about 200,000 years. Okay, so that's already seems very unjust and unfair, right? Considering that we're not the only ones who live here. And this is largely led, I argue, to what we now deem as the Anthropocene, right? Centering of human interests, or anthropocentrism. And this has particularly alarming impact on our ocean, our life-giving ocean. We've all seen these headlines pretty much every time we enter a news source. So this isn't a surprise. But what I'm going to look at is this idea of aquatic rights. And in the legal realm, we talk about water rights, so that might be a bit more familiar. But I'm using the word aquatic rights because I'm centering justice, right? So I looked, and there's not that many definitions of aquatic rights, and when they are there, they're not satisfactory. So the one is about centering, again, the rights of people to use various water bodies for whatever purpose this is. And then the second one, which I like more, but it is from 1856, looks at individuals. Okay, so neither of these are satisfactory because they're largely about use and exploitation, and they're not from the lens of justice. And I'm going to look at that from the different stakeholders. They also don't take into account the Anthropocene, scientific evidence, as we've heard from other speakers, public morality as well. And it really doesn't take into account a lot of the things that we are now valuing as our human population. So I'm glad other speakers have drawn attention to the blue economy, because it's a really nice lens to enter this discussion around justice. And these are just a couple of headlines I pulled over the last few days. We see it's very much on the political agenda. President Biden's made strides. Some of the senators are making strides. But what I want to draw attention to is the wording that we see in the context of this blue economy, right? We see words like substantial opportunities and hubs and acceleration and boundlessness. So there's this idea that we have these resources and they are endless, and that's how we view this ocean, is this endless resource, as well as the animals and the other life that live there. And that's a very problematic way to look at it, and that also contributes to the problem. And those examples are from the global north. It's not just the global north. In South Africa, just as one example, we have the Operation Fakisa, which is also about the blue economy and growing these different areas of aquaculture, offshore oil and gas, etc., etc. So it's very much a global issue, and it might manifest in different ways in jurisdictions, but it's happening across the globe. And there is some good work happening about drawing attention to the injustices within the blue economy, and also highlighting the impact on vulnerable groups, whether that's women, whether that's indigenous rights. These are all very, very important issues that we should be centering, as opposed to commercial interests and economic interests, right? Looking at vulnerability. But notably, even from the study, which takes together a vast variety of other studies to draw out these conclusions, or these 10 main issues, somebody or a group is still overtly missing, and that is animals, right? And I'm really glad that Prof. Hessler has spoken about some of the numbers and the figures, because they really are an important stakeholder in this discussion. And they are often seen as a solution to many of our human problems, especially in the global south. You know, we hear around food security and unemployment, economic goals. We also see them as an alternative to the use of other animals. So as we move away from terrestrial animal agriculture, because we know the harms, whether it's climate harms, resource workers, etc., we're starting to move towards aquaculture and fishing. So as we're moving towards those things, and even having successes for other animals in the terrestrial space, we are further impacting aquatic animals. And those are just some of the proponents who argue for the move to aquatic life over terrestrial life. They argue it's better for the environment, etc., etc. But a lot of those things are simply not true, and there's also just not enough science about it, and not enough visibility about these issues, when in fact it can be even more harmful, given the value that we know ocean and aquatic life has in stabilizing our entire planetary system. So just as a starting point, I want to note that I'm talking about human rights, I'm talking about rights of nature and protecting the environment, but aquatic animals, and actually all animals, are individuals with intrinsic worth. So that is not to take away from the fact that they deserve to be protected in their own right. We value their sentience. We value sentience as a protectable interest in our society, and therefore they should deserve that protection. And we should assume, as Kathy said, flip that switch on assuming that they're sentient rather than that they're not, as we learn more. And as Professor mentioned, the law is really not protective of them. It's not only in the US where they're excluded from the definition of animal in the Animal Welfare Act. In South Africa as well, we don't have them in our Animals Protection Act. They're also excluded from, for example, the Meat Safety Act. And this is a theme we see across jurisdictions around the world. Even if they are included in the definition, they might not be included in cruelty laws. They may be exempted in terms of the practices that are done to them, for example, farming. But in many ways, we're not getting adequate protection for these animals just using a pure animal law lens or an animal-centric lens. So we need to look at other ways to get better protection for them. And this is where this intersectional approach is, where we use other areas of law. And we don't do it purely to get protection for aquatic animals, but to protect the interests of vulnerable humans as well as the environment. So I'm going to be looking mostly at aquaculture, or the farming of aquatic species, fish in particular, and wild caught fishing. And I will draw on examples from other extractive practices when I talk about some case law that's been happening. And obviously, I won't go into all the details, but these are important because purely based on the number of animals that are impacted, but they do present a nice lens through which to view these issues. So from our first stakeholder, an animal interest perspective, based purely on the numbers, these are just how many animals are slaughtered every day from a recent study of our world in data. I won't go through that, but every day hundreds of millions of fish are killed. And every year, again, we can't estimate that because they're measured by the tonnage, but some have tried to provide estimates, and we can see that these are trillions of animals. So if we consider these potentially to be sentient animals worthy of moral consideration, then based purely on the numbers and the rate at which we are killing and potentially slaughtering them, we should care about this, right? It's hard to imagine trillion because our brains kind of can't really comprehend what that looks like, especially when we're talking about individuals. But it's important to start to understand the scale. And it's not only the animals who are farmed that are implicated. There are often insects who are fed to farmed fish, for example, also potentially trillions of insects as feed. There are other animals who are used in aquaculture facilities like cleaner wrasse fish to clean diseases off of animals. Wild animals are implicated, whether it's their migratory routes, whether it's by escapement when they get out of the net pens and integrate into those environments. And then those animals are also fed to other farmed animals. So starting to view the issue more holistically, we're not just looking at the animals who are farmed, but all the animals within this kind of like supply chain, and start to see really how big the impacts are for them. And those animals who are directly utilized suffer from a lot of welfare issues, similar to terrestrial animals in industrial agriculture. Their welfare is severely compromised, not only in their inability to express their natural behaviors, but because of the pure number of animals that are used, injury, death, parasites, stress, all these different sorts of things, deformities. I'll show a couple of examples. So please look away if you have some sensitive eyes, but it's purely to indicate that these animals are not healthy, happy animals living in a beautiful farmed environment, as some would like us to believe. So we've also seen from undercover investigations some of these welfare issues being pulled to the surface more, which is a very useful way to make consumers and people, the public, aware. So again, these are just some pictures of some of the deformities that we can see arising, not the picture of healthy fish that is sold on labels, and the manner in which they are killed. Unlike the requirements, for example, in the US for the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, where some animals are required to be stunned, that doesn't apply to farmed or aquatic animals generally. Similarly, our Meat Safety Act, as I mentioned, there's no requirement for slaughtering in South Africa. So they're often killed in the really horrendous ways that prolong their suffering. So again, these are all sorts of things we should care about if we care about the suffering of sentient animals. These are some examples of diseases that occur due to the intensity in which these animals are farmed and the manner in which they are farmed, the methods that are used. And because of this prevalence of diseases, there are a vast amount of different antibiotics that are utilized in aquaculture. You're not intended to read it. It's just to show you how many are actually approved for use. They're not illegal. It's okay to use these. And we start to see this emergence of this public health crisis as well. It's drug habit, aquaculture's drug habit. Just to give you a sense, I cannot pronounce these, but lot of patented drugs utilized within the industry to control a variety of different ailments, diseases, all sorts of things. And of course, that then implicates our next stakeholder, which is the environment. So really just from a pure human health or animal health or integrated approach, we see just the use of antibiotics can lead to antimicrobial resistance. And then along with that are various kind of like toxicity concerns, mercury, et cetera, et cetera. So from a public health perspective, already we have a problem. But looking at just the environment as our next stakeholder, obviously the use of antibiotics, you can see in the slide there, those, if it's in an open net pen situation, often then subsequently go into the aquatic environment around it, impacting on the various species, on the ecosystems, which we don't actually know long-term what that does, because it's still a relatively new industry, or at least the use of drugs in that context is still quite new. And that's only one potential impact on the environment. As I mentioned, there's escapements, there's the use of GMOs, there's massive pollution inputs, right? That one just says the amount of fish farming pollution equals the same as an entire city in Copenhagen. So it's no joke, the amount of pollution that's coming out of this. That's a graphic representation. Obviously, that's an extreme case, but where you can see this is not really a healthy farmed fish imagery that one might get when they think of buying it in the store. And a broad different array. I won't go through all these different environmental impacts, but it's predominantly when you have that many animals in such a small confinement, there's bound to be huge amounts of waste. A lot of the same things we've seen from terrestrial animal agriculture are coming through in farmed aquatic practices, although there's different and new other kinds of environmental harms, for example, the use of copper sulfate on the nets and things like that. And then, of course, the fact that a lot of fish are caught from the wild to be fed to farmed fish, right? Because there's carnivorous fish there. So what's termed the blue loss is taking animals out of the ocean environment and then feeding them to animals in the farmed environment. So this doesn't really speak like a sustainable industry when you consider the impacts of the wild animals around it. And then, of course, other wild animal impacts, which I won't have time to go into, but if there is time for questions, we can talk more. And then similarly with fishing, already a lot of the speakers have highlighted this. It's not just the animals who are the subject of being fished. There are various other animals caught in bycatch, ghost nets. There's intentional killing. There's also incidental killing. So recently there was an expose about the decline of the great white sharks in South Africa, which is very much a big tourism boom for us because of the fishing industry, right? And the manner in which the fishing was taken out, and also the fact that people were killing these fish even though they weren't allowed to. So starting to see these broader environmental impacts from these practices. And this, again, is just a graphic representation for some who've never kind of understood what a ghost net is or entanglement is. It's really not a pretty picture, especially if you care more about kind of charismatic megafauna versus fishes and things like that. We spoke a bit about their popularity. And then, of course, it's a massive climate change impact. The oceans are huge absorbers. They sequester a huge amount of carbon. And when their health is impacted, it defeats those purposes and obviously contributes to our climate crisis. And then it's not very much on the agenda, at least not as much as it should be, when fish is still served at climate conferences. So there's a kind of disconnect there. The final stakeholder, just to highlight some of the issues, is human rights. I'm going to do it through the lens of consumer protection and workers. And Kathy already showed this kind of imagery. So this is what some people might think is aquaculture, these beautiful pristine waters, when in fact it's a lot of these different kinds of systems that are utilized depending on the species, the jurisdiction, all sorts of different things. But that's what it looks like in practice. And a lot of people have never really even visualized what a fish farm might look like. And similarly with fishing, this idea of what it is versus what it is in practice, just to give a sense that a large trawler can be the size of 13 jumbo jets. So just imagine the number of lives that are implicated in a single day of fishing. And then we have messaging in the media around how fish and aquatic species are healthy, they're good for you, pregnant people should be eating fish. We have these labels, again, the speakers have shown these things saying responsibly farmed, sustainable aquaculture. We have the government encouraging people in different countries, Nordic countries. And then we have this idea of the happy fish, like similar to the happy cow, the happy chicken, right? Marketed towards children. Obviously, none of those animals, at least some of the ones I've shown, can't really be said to be happy when they're not being living in a natural way with diseases and all these other things. So fish is very much still, or seafood, sorry, is still very much part of the dietary guidelines. And we see things, humane washing, greenwashing, all of those things have already come up. Blue washing is the corporate kind of equivalent of that, and that was touched on. And then we have seafood fraud, which is a consumer issue, as well as a health issue for people with allergies and things like that. We also have forced labor, slavery within the industry. It's some of the most dangerous jobs in the world, aquaculture and fishing. It's really not a good profession to be in. It's not a safe profession. And then, of course, yeah, slavery, I use workers lightly because there's a lot of forced labor, which can't be said to be workers. And legally, there's a lot of exemptions from legislation. A lot of people doing this are immigrant or migrant workers, so they're already vulnerable in that sense. They can't necessarily claim the protection of the law, and that's outside of the already exemptions that exist. And then they're subjected to various kinds of injuries and other hazards because of the work, and also because they're slaughtering animals, for example, day in, day out. So I think we are nearly at time. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to go through this quickly, but just to kind of sum some of that up, if we can't use animal law effectively because it doesn't protect the animal interests, then we absolutely should try and use other areas of law, environmental law, whether it's water laws or air pollution laws. Absolutely try and use immigrants law, worker rights, consumer rights, and there is an increase of using those areas of law, and it allows us to bring together groups of different allies to bolster the case, to bolster the arguments, and try really to tackle some common threats and enemies, these big corporate interests, and at least some of the worst industrialized practices, right? Because it does implicate so many different rights. Speaking of, though, we shouldn't lose sight of using rights-based approaches, and Randy did mention some of them. We already have a growing movement of animal rights, especially for aquatic animals, so that is a very positive move that we see being done. We also see the rights of nature being used for them, so that's also positive, specifically turtles, which is quite exciting because that's a very new one, using the rights of nature law to apply to aquatic species. And then just a final example from South Africa I wanted to draw on was where various communities pulled together in a case against Shell, who wanted to do offshore drilling. They were doing seismic surveying, which would have had a major implication not only on the aquatic life across the spectrum, it would have implicated people's livelihoods, their cultural rights, people who believed their ancestors lived in the sea. And it was really, for me, a marriage of bringing together all these different intersections where all these different stakeholders came together, and they used the law in a really beautiful, creative way to challenge this practice. And they were successful in interdicting Shell from exercising their exploitation rights and eventually having it reviewed and set aside. So it is possible to ally together and do this. And that was a really good case in South Africa. A lot of people rallied together who weren't typically allies in a sense, right? And of course, the communities, they're very happy that they were able to stop this, using the law to do this and protect the life and their livelihoods. So yeah, that's just it. I think the overall message is that we can and we must work together, and we must at least try and consider these intersections as we're doing work not only for terrestrial land animals, but also for aquatic animals, and start to kind of pull together these different areas, start to recognize them, and hopefully use some of the legal regulatory frameworks that already exist for us to try and challenge some of these practices. So yeah, that's it from me. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Amy. That was really impactful. You put a lot of information into a very short period of time. I really appreciate it. Are there any questions from the attendees? I guess I'll ask the last question then, which is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Well, that's a tough one. I think I have moments, right? Sometimes I feel very, very optimistic when I think there's good news, like the Shell case, for example. I think it's an amazing thing to see that kind of thing happening, especially in my home country, right? But then obviously we saw some of the presentations today, right? It's still very much on an upward kind of trajectory towards not doing things well. But I think, like I say, I think what gives me hope is drawing together these different groups and trying to help people see the connection between them. It's not an animal rights issue. You asked Kathy earlier, right? Why do we care about animals when there's all this human suffering? And that's not the case. It's not a whataboutism thing. It's connected. We're all part of the same planet. We all fundamentally have the same kind of interests, and where we can use those, let's use them together. And then where we can't, let's, you know, figure something out. But let's try and take the big issues first and band together. So yeah.
I have a comment from Jenna. She says, this is a fantastic presentation. Thank you. Would you be willing to give this for the World Aquatic Veterinary Association? So
Thank you. That's very, yeah, I mean, vets are very intimidating, but sure, you're happy to reach out to me. I don't know if my email is there, but I can drop it in, hopefully, maybe. Can I write in the chat? Or I'll pop my email in the chat, but thanks very much.
great. Any other questions from the group? Well, thank you again to all of our speakers for their time and their passion and their efforts to inform us about this very important area of animal and environmental law. And thanks to our attendees for your patience. It's been a long program, but I know it was worth my time. So I wish all of you a good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.